Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Deku went inside Dendrogram VR game? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. July 15th, on this date, the VR MMO Infinite Dendrogram was released around the world. It had been nearly half a century since man had first dreamt of a VR MMO, virtual reality massively multiplayer online, game, and over a century and a half since the glowing baby incident in Qingling, China, signaled the dawn of quirks. In early 2100s, right after society began to recover from the massive upheaval caused by the emergence of quirks and the world finally began to accept the superhuman age it had been swept into, a variety of media, such as manga, anime, and video games, began to incorporate VR MMOs into their stories as the ultimate dream game. Contrary to popular belief, while heroes and villains were popular topics, they weren't everything the world revolved around. There were still people who liked movies, cartoons, and of course, video games. In fact, the beginning of the 22nd century was known as the Second Renaissance due to the major boom in progress in all fields, including entertainment. During this time and beyond, among a sea of creative entertainment, people eagerly looked forward to the release of a VR MMO, and in the 2110s, after years of extensive research, quasi-VR headsets were released, offering enhanced quality of sight and sound immersion. Although at first a mere product of fantasy, VR MMOs were anticipated, developed, and then finally given form. In the 2130s, a small number of full-dive VR MMO games were released, allowing players to enter game worlds using all 5 of their senses. The reason so few were released was due to the difficulty and enormous cost of development. This meant that only companies with leading technology and sufficient resources could even make an attempt. Or perhaps more were attempted, but never completed. However, the few completed games that did make it out into the world were quickly met with disappointment. Unlike the VR MMOs depicted in fiction, these ones lacked in realism, they assailed the senses with discomfort, and their graphics were hardly any different from existing game systems. Also, despite guarantees of a safe design, players one after another fell ill and were taken to the hospital. And the fact that the standard VR gear didn't work on people with specific mutation type or other incompatible quirks also made them rapidly unpopular, as it meant a decent chunk of the target audience was excluded from playing. The development companies behind the initial dive VR MMOs all went bankrupt due to poor sales, bad reputations, and numerous lawsuits from afflicted and offended players. A reviewer from the time had the following to say about these games: "They managed to create the dream game, but they weren't able to create the dream." Dive VR MMO games continued to be developed, but none were made that could be considered a success. That is, until Infinite Dendrogram was released. The lack of information about Infinite Dendrogram before its release was abnormal. It was kept secret the whole time, and on the day of its release, the developers only made one announcement simultaneously across the global media networks. In it, they presented 4 key selling points for the game. First, the 5 senses would be perfectly simulated. Second, even if there were 100 million players, all of them would play in the same game world on a single server. Third, players could choose how they'd view the game world, with options including realistic, 3D CG, and 2D anime. Fourth, time within the game would flow 3 times faster than in the real world. In response to the announcement, voices from around the world could be heard saying, "Is this really even possible? Just how much money and tech did they use to make this? What kind of tech-based quirk could even create something like this? Even for a case of misleading advertisement, isn't this going a bit far?" Although the announcement had an impact, people found its content simply absurd. Out of everyone that saw the announcement, and this included non-gamers, 99.9998% of them didn't believe it and didn't buy the game. One would think a superhuman society would be more believing of marvelous things like that, but apparently that wasn't actually the case with many people. The remaining 0.0002% of people, however, said things like, "It seems like a lie, but what if it's true? I'll try it, I believe it," and they headed into stores to buy the game. The necessary hardware cost around 10,000 yen and was an extraordinary, some would even say reckless, pricing scheme. What was even more amazing was the fact that people with incompatible quirks could submit the exact specifications of the sizes they needed and what their powers did, and receive specialized VR gear custom designed for them at no additional cost. This helped lure in customers, with some saying, well, even if it's a lie, it's only 10,000 yen, hey, at least we can actually play this game. If they're going so far as to create custom VR sets for free, then I might as well check it out. So they bought it and started playing. And once they logged into the game, they all knew it was the real thing. Overcome with amazement at the game's realism, they would log out and look at their clocks, only to be astonished even more. The dreams they saw were all real. The dream game was now a reality. The day after Infinite Dendrogram's release, amid the clamor set off around the world by posts and comments from those who played the game, the developers released another announcement. This time, the contents of the game were detailed. A man named Lewis Carroll, the lead developer for Infinite Dendrogram, presented the broadcast announcement and said the following. The game system in Infinite Dendrogram has a special feature. Rather than relying on thousands of possible combinations of jobs and skills, this feature provides absolute and distinct uniqueness. This feature is the Embryo. It will offer players truly infinite possibilities and unique customization. Embryos will respond to personal circumstances and evolve from among an infinite number of patterns. These patterns will not merely be different colors and parts, but will even include unique skills and abilities, allowing them to be truly limitless in scope. This is what Infinite Dendrogram is all about. Yes, Infinite Dendrogram will provide you with a new world and your very own unique possibility. These words served as the last trigger needed to turn the game into a giant movement. Hell, when the new hero ranking leaderboards came out that year, not a single person even. For once, there was a facet of the entertainment industry that drowned out even the pro-hero craze. After all, why worry about some heroes out in this world, when you could become a hero yourself in another one? October 16, 2144, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku was sitting on his heels with the game in front of him, and a nervous expression plastered on his face. It probably sounded like an exaggeration, but after waiting around half a year, which was when he had first noticed the game, Izuku was finally going to be able to play Infinite Dendrogram. So, of course, he was nervous. Understandable, considering the circumstances that led him there. It's been a long road, he said to himself. It had been approximately 7 months since he had given up his long-time dream of being a hero. Strike that, it had been 7 months since he had modified his dream of being a hero and had decided to take a more realistic path in life. It was with a heavy heart that he had finally given up on being a hero like All Might. Looking back now, he still felt deep in his heart that he could be a pro-hero. It was something he was unable to properly let go of, owing to the fact that he was a huge fan of heroes, and it had been a childhood dream of his. Sometimes, however, dreams weren't possible to make reality. Don't misunderstand, he had no regrets on the new path he had chosen, but he still couldn't help but mourn the fact that he himself had come to accept the futility of his own dream. Or, more accurately, had come to accept that maybe his talents lay in a different direction. It all started towards the middle of his own second year of junior high. It was then that Izuku Midoriya made a friend. Not a friend like Kabakugo, but an actual friend. Funnily enough, they met during a villain attack. Not exactly a normal way to make friends, but it was certainly an efficient one. He had saved her life, in a fit of bravery that seemed so unlike him, nearly at the cost of his own life. He'd landed in the hospital for a week in intensive care, and might not even have survived if Recovery Girl hadn't been nearby at the time. He didn't get off completely unscathed, however. The scars on his upper arms and chest were a constant reminder that he had almost died. It was when he had woken up again after a harrowing surgery and quirk-assisted healing that he had an epiphany. He couldn't become a pro-hero. To some, it might have been funny that such a realization had come after he saved someone's life from a real villain, but the whole incident had taught Izuku something. He couldn't ignore the gap in power between a quirkless person like himself and those with powers, no matter how weak. The villain he had faced that day hadn't been a powerful one. His only power was the ability to extend his fingernails to a certain degree, which he had sharpened to a rather terrifying point, but was ultimately no sharper than a common knife. He had taken a foreigner a couple years older than him as a hostage, and the heroes, as a result, were unable to do anything as there was no one with a quirk that would let them manipulate the situation in their favor. Izuku, who had left home alone to gather groceries, was the only person nearby. For a few moments he had stood, frozen in fear. But when the villain drew blood from the neck of his hostage, it was like a switch had been pulled in his mind. For a few moments, he wasn't the same meek kid who regularly got picked on by everyone around him. And then, Izuku threw his bag, mimicking Kamui Wood's lacquered wood-binding prison move, and managed to nail the villain in the eye with a pen. In the single second the villain was distracted, his body had moved of its own volition and he had ran forward, and thrown himself in front of the fallen hostage just as the villain recovered and slashed with his claws. The wounds he had sustained were serious, and he was lucky that the major vessels in his body were left relatively undamaged, though there was damage to his lungs and liver, and he required surgery due to the fact that the villain's nails were embedded in his body, as they had snapped off when the pro-heroes had recovered their wits and intervened. That was why, when Izuku woke up, he saw just how unrealistic his dream was. He'd nearly died against a guy with long fingernails. And he wanted to be a hero like All Might? Preposterous. And it wasn't only the gap in the base power between himself and those with quirks that he had come to see. Izuku had also realized the fact that he had done nothing to go towards his dream in the first place, except just constantly saying that he wanted to. If he didn't have a power, then the least he could do to actively pursue his dream would be to work out and master at least 3 or 4 different fighting styles. What had he done? Absolutely nothing. It was enlightening for sure, to realize just how messed up his thought processes had been. The problem was, Izuku Midoriya had still believed that he could somehow still manifest a quirk, nearly a decade after the age they were supposed to appear. When he thought back on why the hell he hadn't brought himself to the peaks of physical human parameters through training, that was the only answer that came to mind. He hadn't worked out because he was busy dreaming about what kind of hero he would be instead of actually working towards it, waiting for a quirk to just drop into his lap. How unrealistic. What was this? A shonen anime. How deluded had he been to think that he could somehow gain a power after so long? And more importantly, the deciding factor that led to Izuku's realization was the fact that not only would he fail as a hero the way he was now, but he would actually put more people in danger, with how foolish he had been. It was humbling to be sure. And it made him see with absolute certainty that he could never achieve his dream, no matter how hard he tried. In his own eyes, someone like him shouldn't even be allowed to become a pro in the first place. Not that he would even have passed the UA entrance exams, but until he could get his act together, he didn't have what it took to be a hero. And it wasn't about whether or not he had a quirk, surprisingly enough. It was when he had come to that horrifying, crushing realization when Izuku had met the girl he had saved with his act of bravery. Then he had made his first friend, a French girl named Francesca Gautier, who was a first-year student at I-Island University. She had been in Japan in order to catch her plane to Island in order to begin her first year of college and had unfortunately gotten caught up in all this just a couple hours before her flight. Fortunately, she was able to explain her situation to the university, who still allowed her to attend due to the fact that such a thing was out of their hands and surprisingly common. However, this left her with nowhere to stay until the next flight, which was a week later, since transport to I-Island was only possible when it reached certain checkpoints, since the artificial city was always on the move. His mother was more than happy to take her in. And so they ended up living together for a couple days, and with Izuku's realization gnawing on his mind, it was only a few days before the topic ultimately came up. What Francesca had told him that day had led to a true turning point in his life. A pro hero? To me, you're someone who just wants to help others in any way they can. A pro hero is just a mold that society tries to fit those kind of people into. Take it from me, Izuku. The reason you're so fixated on pro heroes in particular is because you're trying to fit in with your peers, not because you really want it. Someone like you would be content helping others, no matter what kind of method you use towards that end. You could be a doctor or even a lawyer, but you would be happy since you would be able to help someone. Don't stunt your own talents by trying to narrow your own thinking just to do what everyone else thinks is proper or cool. I wouldn't have been able to move forward in my life if I hadn't come to that realization, Izuku. Just like when he was young and had asked his mother if he could really become a hero without a quirk, those weren't the words he wanted to hear. But those were the words he needed to hear. He couldn't help but see the truth in them. He'd always been the kind of person to try and follow the norm, even before he'd been diagnosed as quirkless. Could that be why he saw no other path moving forward than becoming a pro-hero? So he could fit in? So he could stick it in the faces of the people who constantly mocked and denied him? Izuku honestly couldn't say for sure. But what could he do now? What did he want to do with his life, now that he'd delegated heroics as out of the question? He was smart. Really smart. Sure, it was stunted due to his own lack of self-esteem and confidence, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. That was pretty much the only talent he had left to go on. And fortunately, this time, it was more than good enough. We have plenty of people who beat up villains. What we don't have in numbers are people who use their brains to help society. It had been during one of his later conversations with Francesca, who, rather surprisingly, disliked pro-heroes. The reason seemed to be rather personal, so he didn't pry, but he could tell it wasn't something she would budge on. The next day, Izuku and his mother waved off Francesca at the airport, and Izuku found the path he wanted to take. Island Academy. It was something both his mother and Francesca were supportive of, especially when the latter explained that his quirk analysis notebooks would make him a shoo-in for that department. She'd said it as an offhanded comment, but Izuku found himself liking the idea. It was a fresh start. No Bakugo. No people from Aldra to continuously make him miserable. It was the best high school in the world, heroics aside. And most importantly, it was a place where science and reason ruled. Scientists tended not to discriminate very much, especially when quirks were involved. Honestly, this seemed like paradise to him. So from that night itself, Izuku began to work tirelessly towards his new dream. To help people using the power of science. To make the world a better place, both as a quirk analyst and an engineer of support items. Both were fields he was interested in, though they were usually overshadowed by his heroic aspirations. His old dreams still flickered in his heart, but Izuku managed to put it aside, so he could achieve his more realistic one. So he studied and studied and studied. He was working at least 17 hours a day, only pausing for bathroom breaks, food and a few short naps. Izuku had the awareness to know that getting into I-Island was not going to be easy. In fact, getting into UA would have actually been easier. He would be competing with geniuses from around the world for the limited number of spots available in I-Island Academy. And that meant he needed to be on top of his game, or he would fail. Failure was something that Izuku could no longer accept. Not when his own hard work, instead of an outside factor like a quirk, was the only thing deciding whether he would succeed or not. I-Island Academy, much like UA, had multiple courses. There was the engineering course, for those interested in the creation of support items. Then came the quirk analysis course, for those people interested in quirk research and its finer aspects. The last of the specialized courses was the medical science course, for those interested in becoming doctors and pioneering medical technology. Of course, there was a general studies course as well, but the main competition would be for the first three. It was possible for a student to take a hybrid course as well, as Izuku himself was attempting to, but in order to do that he had to earn a spot in both the quirk analysis and engineering courses, and then work out the details with the principal. It definitely wasn't a walk in the park, but it was something that wasn't as far away as becoming a pro hero. Quirk analysis was something Izuku had been doing since he could walk, so he was confident that he could easily pass the exam for that course. But he knew next to nothing about engineering. So he rectified that. Over the next couple of months, Inko Midoriya began to worry that her son had turned into a hermit. He never came out anymore. He had went to Aldra and finished his junior high exams within a week of Francesca's departure, and whenever she went in to give him food or try to force him to rest, she found him surrounded by no less than 7 different books on mechanical engineering and physics. It was kind of terrifying, but it was also relieving to see that Izuku was focusing so much on something other than heroics. While Inko herself had never been able to tell him, she did believe he could have become a pro hero. With the amount of dedication he showed towards the things he was interested in, quirk or no quirk, he would go that far. What she didn't believe was that everything from then on would be easier. Heroes got hurt all the time, and without a quirk to back him up, Izuku would inevitably get serious injuries, just like he did that horrible day in the grocery store. And worst of all, she knew that even if he became a pro hero, society would never accept him. Not without something short of a miracle, anyway. The other pros, vying for fame and fortune, would always be putting him down, and Inko didn't want to know how her baby would take getting bullied as a hero. So she was grateful her Izuku had chosen a different path in life, as was her husband, and that he felt just as strongly about it as he did about his heroics. She just wished he wouldn't overwork himself like that. Unfortunately, as she was well aware of, you couldn't get everything in life. But she was more than happy with what she did have. She had a loving husband and a talented, but most importantly, happy son. She could almost feel her stress levels fading away. For almost 6 months, things had gone on this way, with a few breaks in between when Izuku inevitably wore himself out. Then he would talk to Francesca, who had gotten settled in at Island by that point. Funnily enough, he was getting more social experience than he had ever possessed in his life as a shut-in. Then the exams had come, and Izuku had left his room for the first time in months, in order to grab his future with his own 2 hands. And as with anyone who had worked that hard for their goals, he had succeeded. Only a few days ago, he had received a letter from Island telling him that he had been accepted into both the engineering and the quirk analysis courses, and that he was to report to Island by October 20th in order to be assigned his living quarters and work out his schedule while he was there. The school term would begin on November 8th. The plane tickets for himself and his mother were already included, which meant all he needed to do was just get on board the aircraft that would take him one step closer to his new dream. And for the first time in his rather short life, Izuku felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He'd finally succeeded in something after he had spent so long thinking he was destined for failure. When he had texted Francesca about his acceptance into Island Academy, she had congratulated him, and then sent over a package which had reached him that very day. He had opened it in and found a copy of Infinite Dendrogram along with the necessary hardware. Before he could call her and try to send it back, she sent him a text stating that it was the least she could do considering he had saved her life and hosted her for a week. Plus, now that he was finished with this endeavor for the time being, he could join her in the game and they could play together. Unwilling to invoke her wrath by protesting further, Izuku just decided to roll with it. Besides, it wasn't every day that someone outside his mother did something nice for him. She'd told him about Infinite Dendrogram during one of their conversations when he was preparing for the exams. She said that all the rumors about it were right, and that it was a game he simply had to play. She didn't tell him any details because he was busy studying, and he didn't look anything about it up, in order to avoid spoiling the experience and his own preparation. If the game was really as amazing as everyone said, then he doubted even someone like him, who never really played video games, could resist it, so he decided to just put it out of his mind until he had the time for it. After reminiscing over the chain of events that had led him to that very moment, Izuku finally braced himself and opened the box. Honestly, he was being kind of silly and he knew it. It wasn't as if the box contained a bomb or something. Inside it were a helmet-type game system and a manual. According to the manual, in order to enter the game world, all one needed to do was put on the helmet and turn on the switch. There were other explanations regarding visuals and time as well, but amazing would be the only way Izuku could describe them. Really, just how in the world did they make this game? Izuku wondered. Even with the current advancements in the field of science, it seemed to be 10, maybe 20 years ahead of current technology. However, Izuku knew it wasn't the time to be scared. Following the instructions and recommendations in the manual, he put on the helmet and lay on his bed facing the ceiling. Izuku then took a deep breath and turned on the game. Instantly, his vision went black. Hello and welcome. Before Izuku knew it, he was no longer in his room, but in a space that appeared to be the study of a Western-style, wooden building. The voice had come from a cat he had never seen before, which sat in front of me on a seemingly well-made wooden rocking chair. Wait a minute. A cat? I'm so sorry for the intrusion, Izuku said. He was confused but decided to respond with a greeting first. "Yes, that's nice," said the cat. "I like people with proper manners." The cat spoke in fluent Japanese, but with a slow drawl at the end of his sentences. "Is this like the game's tutorial or something?" Izuku asked. "That's right. You'll be sent into the game after you finish configuring various settings here." "Oh, I'm Cheshire, Control AI number 13 for Infinite Dendrogram. Nice to meet you." Control AI. Things made sense to Izuku now. No wonder it was able to use fuzzy logic in its responses. Control AIs were man-made cyber intelligences with entire modern supercomputers serving as their brains. Their primary use, as the name suggested, are in control and management. It was said that just one of them can perfectly, and at high speeds, manage the databases and networks of a small country. It was quite amazing what technology was capable of in this day and age. People were also more accepting of AIs since there were people out there who could cause global extinction, so they didn't need to worry about a Terminator reenactment. If this one was number 13, then did that mean there were 12 other control AIs of equal ability involved in managing this game? "Nice to meet you too," said Izuku. "All right," said the cat. "First up is selecting the graphics. Samples of these will alternate, so choose which one you like the best." "These." After the cat, Cheshire, said this, the surrounding scenery completely changed. The study they were in turned into a spacious area, a somewhat Middle Ages European townscape. There were many people walking about, and after a fixed PRD of time, their appearance would change. Actually, it wasn't their appearance, but rather, the way he saw them was changing. It went from a realistic appearance to CG, from CG to anime, and then back to realistic. "Wait, how are you doing this?" he asked, perplexed. "Imagery perceived by sight is processed by the brain, after all, so there's a way," replied Cheshire. "And so, the way you see can be changed like this, but which one will you go with? You can change it later by using an item." "I'll leave it as it is, Cheshire-san," Izuku said. He thought that it would be better to see normally until he got used to the game, so that was the option he went for. Although he was interested in how it would feel to touch something that looked like it was from an anime. "Okay," said Cheshire, and the scenery reverted back to the study. "Next is your player name. What do you want your name to be in the game? Oh, and before you answer, know that the names of pro heroes are banned in any shape or form. Too many legal issues sprang up in the first few days since everyone wanted to be All Might. I'll go with Dekiru," said Izuku, his expression flickering for a moment. Deku was a twist on his name that Bakugo had given him as a nickname, meaning useless. But Izuku was determined to leave that part of his life behind, so he twisted it himself into Dekiru, which meant, "You can do it." It was a name that he was proud of and a symbol of how he was moving forward from the darker times of his childhood. Honestly, it was also because he wasn't very creative when it came to usernames. Normally, he would just include something that had to do with All Might, but that apparently wasn't an option here. Plus, there was just something about that name that seemed to click with the game he was playing. After all, Infinite Dendrogram seemed to be all about the ability to do anything. Interesting choice. "Okay, then I'll set it to Thayet," said the cat. "Next, the settings for your appearance." After Cheshire said this, a featureless mannequin and a bunch of window screens appeared before Izuku. These screens contained words such as height, weight, bust, their corresponding sliders, as well as facial features. "These are," he said slowly and rather awkwardly. "Use those parts and sliders to make your own avatar for the game," said Cheshire. "Oh, you can also make it into an animal like me or even change your gender." "I'm not so sure about changing my gender in a game this realistic." "It's okay to take your time and think it over," said Cheshire. "We have 3 times the amount of time here than in the real world." "Oh yeah, there was that one time when someone repeatedly logged in and out and spent 1 month in Earth time making their avatar." That seemed like a tremendous amount of effort that Izuku wasn't sure he could reproduce. It wasn't just because of the sheer number of sliders and parts, but the values you could set for each of them were way too exact. It was almost like they were telling him to make a real human face. For a beginner, that was way too difficult, Izuku thought. Honestly, though he racked his brains, he couldn't come to a decision regarding what appearance to pick for his avatar. Obviously, he wasn't supposed to use his real appearance when he was playing online, but he'd rather keep his body the way it was so it didn't cause too much of a discrepancy in his daily life by messing up his reflexes and muscle movements. He had no idea what to do. But in that case, Cheshire-san, I know this is a strange request, but can you design my avatar for me? Asked Izuku, reddening from embarrassment. All I know is that I want it to resemble my real body, but I don't know where to go from there. That's an unusual request, said Cheshire, stroking his chin thoughtfully. But I think it can be done. Avatars aren't my specialty, however, so I'll have to contact one of my colleagues. Please wait a moment. Cheshire walked over to the corner of the room before disappearing, leaving Izuku alone, who was fidgeting nervously. A few minutes later, he returned with a girl in tow, who looked like she had been brought straight out of a fairy tale, though she had a presence like an elder sister. She took a look at him and smiled playfully. Hello. I'm Control AI number 1, Alice, and my domain is avatars. Cheshire told me you want us to create yours. That's a request that can most certainly be done. After all, Infinite Dendrogram is all about freedom. Although I must admit, you are the first person to ask us to help you pick your avatar, she said rather cheerfully. Why yes, stuttered Izuku. Can you please make it similar to my original body though? Okay. In fact, I don't think that I have to change much at all. You're a rather cute one for sure. I know just how to bring out your natural charm to its fullest potential. Exclaimed Izuku, reddening furiously, as Alice began tapping away at the model of his body, which had transformed to become his mirror image. She made a few fine adjustments he couldn't understand, though it didn't change the way he looked in the least, but then removed his freckles and slightly altered his hairstyle. His hair color had been changed to a cloudly white, and his eyes were the color of polished silver. In fact, he looked kind of good that way. In a way, with minimal effort, Alice had created an image of him that he was okay with, and one that was closely similar to his real face, but with a few tiny adjustments that made it surprisingly hard to recognize as his own. There we go. Is it to your liking? Why yes it is. Thank you very much, Alice-san. She giggled at him. You're an interesting one. I'll be watching you, Dekiru. Enjoy your time in Infinite Dendrogram. And I hope you don't mind that I kind of turned you into a Shota, though is that really the case, since he's actually a young teenager? Huh. What was that last part? Before he could ask again, Alice had vanished in a shower of pixels, leaving him alone with Cheshire, who had been silently watching the whole affair with a large level of amusement. Is that the avatar you choose? He drawled. Why's it is. Then I'll hand over your starting items. Cheshire waved a padded paw in the air and a bag fell from empty space. This is your storage bag, also known as your inventory. The storage space inside it is from a different dimension. You can store items in here if they're yours, but on the flip side, you can't put any items in here that aren't. I see. Izuku said. It was a useful bag, but Izuku guessed that meant it couldn't be used to commit crimes. Well, Cheshire continued, if it's an item that dropped from someone you piked, or one that you stole with the steal skill, then it'll go in. Izuku fell silent. He didn't know what to say to that. By the way, if a player's steal skill is high enough in level, they can steal an item from even inside this 4D pocket-like item bog, the cat said. So be careful. Now, just how exactly am I supposed to be careful against a thief that's capable of stealing from the fourth dimension? This bag is for beginners, but there are also other types, such as ones that are tough to steal from, small ones, and ones with a lot of capacity. The cat said. What is the capacity of this one, Cheshire-san? Izuku asked. The size is about equal to one classroom, and the weight is maybe around 1 ton in Earth measurements. It can fit quite a lot. Izuku muttered. That's plenty of space. It's apparently not enough if you're a merchant though, said the cat. They're likely to buy new ones. Oh, item bags will scatter their contents around if they get destroyed, so pay attention to their durability. I'll be careful. Izuku promised. Next is a set of beginner equipment. Dekiru, what will you pike? Cheshire pulled a catalog from a bookshelf and showed it to him. In it were full sets of various types of armor. There was the typical Eastern and Western style armor, but in addition to these, there were traditional outfits from China, India, the Middle East, and South America. On the opposite end, there were even outfits that seemed to be from sci-fi movies. "I'll take this one," said Izuku, pointing to one of the outfits in the sci-fi section. It included a Red Riding Hood-style cloak in black, and a bodysuit that covered him completely, which was a light shade of gray and had bright, white lines resembling circuits running through it. For some reason, the futuristic mage look seemed to appeal to him. "What will you pick for your first weapon?" the cat asked. Izuku turned to a different page in the catalog. All kinds of weapons were listed, including a wooden sword, a practice sword with a dull blade, a knife, a bow, a sling, and a staff. He decided to choose something that matched his outfit's theme. "I'll go with the staff," Izuku said. "So for your weapon and equipment." "Wasm." It was pretty hard to tell if Cheshire's voice was energetic or not, but as he said that, Izuku's appearance changed. His outfit switched to the one he had just chosen, and a staff was now strapped across his back, underneath his cloak. Most impressive of all, his appearance had changed to mirror the avatar he had selected earlier. "Wow, this is amazing!" exclaimed Izuku as he looked at himself in the full-length mirror Cheshire had provided. He looked pretty good, and noticed that Alice had also made his hair a tad bit lighter than it was normally. "Oh yeah, that's right, here's your starting money." Cheshire handed him 5 coins that appeared to be made out of silver. 5 silver coins is worth 5,000 lire. 1 rice ball costs about 10 lire, by the way. Then 1 lire would be about 10 yen, Izuku thought. In that case, 5,000 lire is a lot of money. Is it okay to get this much in the beginning?" Izuku asked. "Yep. Be sure to learn how to make money before it runs out though," he said. In other words, he probably wouldn't get any more after this, so he had to use it wisely. "Well then, it's finally time to transfer your embryo," he said. "Oh, that's the thing in all the rumors," Izuku said. He'd heard they were the greatest feature in Infinite Dendrogram. They offered true uniqueness and evolved in infinite ways based on the player. They were partners that exceeded the likes of items and equipment. Francesca, who had already played the game, said, "If this hadn't been a well-made dive VR MMO, but just a regular MMO instead, I'm sure it still would have been a huge success as long as it had the biosystem." "Do you need an explanation on embryos?" asked the cat. "Yes, since you're offering, I guess I should listen to it," Shisireson said Izu. It was probably for the best to hear the tutorials for unique systems like that one, after all. "Okay," said the cat. "All players receive an bio at the start. The only time they'll look the same is while they are in this Zeroth form. With the first form and beyond, they'll change in completely different ways based on their own air." "Oh, wow," Izuku said. He wasn't a gamer, but he was an enthusiast regarding any kind of power, so he couldn't help but be fascinated by features that allowed for something to be totally unique. "Although the possibilities are infinite, there are some rough categories," added the cat. "Oh, I didn't know that," Izuku said. His decision to avoid talking about it with Francesca and looking it up online made it so that he had barely any true information on Infinite Dendrogram. The broad categories are: Type Arms, a device type that players can equip as a weapon or armor. Type Guardian, a monster type that protects the player. Type Chariot, a vehicle type that players can ride. Type Castle, a building type that players can reside in. Type Territory, a barrier type that players can deploy. That's about it. "That's amazing," gasped Izuku. "It's like the different categories of quirks. It's incredible how detailed this all is." He was starting to get excited to see how his own bio would turn out. Also, besides these ones, there are rare and advanced categories that an bio can evolve into, too. There are even categories that are unique to one embryo. It'd be nice if you could get on. "Wow!" Izuku exclaimed, before going into deep thought and muttering to himself. But if that's the case, there are bound to be players who keep resetting their character until they get a rare category. "You can't remake your character in this game," said the cat, who seemed to have been able to pick up on it without a problem. "Huh. Even if someone bought different hardware and played the game, that person would log in as the same character as the first time," Cheshire explained. Their Embryo would also be the Sami. This is because we keep records on our side of users' brainwave data. Izuku was silent. They record our brainwave data, Izuku thought nervously. Yeah, that sounds kind of scary. Even if they were able to reset, it's all based on that person anyway, so I think their Embryo would end up exactly the Sami, said the cat. Is that how it worked? And while we were talking, your Embryo finished transferring. Cheshire added. Izuku realized that on the back of his left hand, the only place that his bodysuit didn't cover, was now embedded a faintly glowing oval gem. That's your embryo? Cheshire said. It'll be stuck to your left hand during its Zeroth form, but it'll come off after it hatches and reaches its first form. In other words, Izuku guessed it was sort of like he incubating an egg. Or embryo. Cheshire-san, is there any chance it can break while it's an egg? He asked. That won't happen, said the cat. Any damage an embryo receives while in its Zeroth form will be passed on to the player. Ah, I see. So that means the embryo will be safe even if the player dies. But after they hatch, embryos can be damaged and break like anything else, the cat said. They'll self-repair over time. It was kind of like a living creature. By the way, after your embryo turns into its first form, a tattoo of a crest will appear where the egg was, said the cat. It serves as a sort of identification for players in this world. Without it, you wouldn't be able to tell players apart from NPCs. Is that so? Izuku asked, slightly incredulous. But no, there's no way I would mistake an NPC for a human. Right. Also, the crest has the ability to store your embryo, said the cat. When you don't need it, you can keep your embryo in your left hand. You'll be together with it as long as you play this game, so please take care of it. You understood, Cheshire-san, said Izuku. It felt like he was being entrusted with a baby. I'm still not sure how my embryo will evolve, but that's okay. It all comes down to oneself anyway, so I guess it'll work out on its own. But I wonder what kind of powers it'll give me. I'll be sure to take excellent care of you, he said to the egg on the back of his hand. Needless to say, there was no response from his embryo, but Izuku got the feeling that it had shined slightly. Lastly, please choose which nation to join. Cheshire laid out a map on the study's desk. It was an old scroll map. After it was unfurled, however, pillars of light rose up from 7 locations on the map, and from within them, Izuku could see various towns. The nations with pillars of light are the ones you can join in the beginning. What you see in the pillars is the capital of each nation. Floating in letters of light around each of the pillars was the name and explanation of each nation. Surrounded by castle walls is a Western fantasy town, with a white limestone castle at its center. Kingdom of Altar, the land of knights. Sakura petals dance through the air in this city made of wood. A Japanese-style castle looms high above it. Tenchi, the land of blades. Subtle elegance hangs in the air of these mountains. A large river flows for all eternity through its valleys. Huanghe Empire, the land of the hermits. Black smoke rises from countless factories and forms a cloud that blocks out the sky. On the ground is a modern-day city made of steel. Drife Imperium, the land of machines. Bazaars nestle up to a giant oasis, surrounded by desert as far as the eye can see. Caldina, the commercial city-state union. Made from connecting countless large ships together, this man-made landmass floats in the middle of the open sea. Granvaloa, the maritime nation. At the base of Yggdrasil deep in the forest, elves, fairies, and demi-humans live in this secluded garden of flowers. Legendaria, the homelands of fairies. This is so incredible, Izuku said, struck with awe. Seeing this makes me want to visit every one of them, Izuku thought. Tenchi has a similar feel to the Azuchi-Momoyama PRD, while Huanghe gives off a sense of Chinese fantasy. Drife seems like they'd have robots, and just walking through the bazaars of Caldina would feel like I was sightseeing. The seas of Granvaloa seem like an excellent place to find an adventure, and as for Legendaria, there's no need to even think of a reason to try and go there. However, I'll go with the Drife Imperium, Izuku said. Okay, said the cat. By the way, as a quick survey, What would your reason for choosing that be? My friend is waiting for me there. Oh, is that so? He had called Francesca just before he'd opened the game, and she'd said, then I'll be waiting for you in the Drife Imperium's capital. It's where my clan's base is, anyways. While Izuku was personally more oriented towards places like Altar, since knights were basically ancient pro-heroes, and Legendaria, because Magic Francesca was the one who invited him to the game in the first place and was the only player he knew. At least until he could get a handle on the basics, he needed her help so he didn't get lost or something, which seemed like a real possibility considering how complex Infinite Dendrogram seemed to be. There are events that allow you to change the nation you belong to, so don't feel so down about it, said the cat. Yeah, thank you, Cheshire-san. Izuku said. He was really overthinking it. For all he knew, the Drife Imperium, although it sounded like the child of Nazi Germany, could actually be a nice place. Plus, it wasn't like he would be locked to one area, anyways. Okay then, I'm going to send you to the Drife Imperium's royal capital, Vandalheim, said the cat. Ah, just a second, Cheshire-san. What are the goals in this game? Izuku wasn't an expert on video games, but common knowledge stated that they had established goals such as defeating the evil god or demon king. He thought this game would be the same, but when he asked this to Cheshire, anything, was the response he got. Anything? Izuku asked, perplexed. That's what I meant. Anything. You can become a hero or the demon king, a king or SLV, a good person or an evil person. You can do something, or you can do nothing. You can stay in Infinite Dendrogram, or leave it. It's all up to you. If it's possible, then you can do anything you want. Cheshire's way of speaking had changed. Just like the embryo on your left hand, what's about to begin is infinite in possibility. His speech had morphed from the slow drawl. It was almost as if he were narrating something. Welcome to Infinite Dendrogram. We warmly welcome you, a voice said. As soon as these words were spoken, the study disappeared. From Izuku's surroundings, the desk, the bookshelf, and even Cheshire vanished, and he was left floating in the air. Below him was a familiar-looking world. He was looking down on the same continent he'd seen on the map just moments earlier. Before long, almost as if his body was being ethied down toward one point on the continent, the Drife Imperium Izuku started to fall at a great speed. Aya. And just like that, Izuku Midoriya set foot in the world of Infinite Dendrogram. In the coming months, Izuku Midoriya, or Dekiru as he would be known in that world, would experience many things he had never even believed possible. He would fight monsters ranging from the smallest of slimes to the likes of the superior unique boss monster, the Tri-Zenith Dragon, Gloria, which was capable of vaporizing mountains with a single strike of its claws. He and his embryo would go on great adventures together, ranging from the Corpse Fortress incident in Granvaloa's southern seas to the cause behind the Drife Imperium's food shortages. He would make countless friends of all shapes, sizes and personalities, like the high-end princess of the Imperium, Claudia, Drife, that he could stand by proudly, and even great enemies, like the King of Crimes, Sex Werfel. He would become a hero of great renown, just like he had always dreamed, and find happiness and even love in this world of infinite possibilities. And most importantly, he would find out that Infinite Dendrogram was so much more than just a game. The culmination of all these things was none other than the tale of Dekiru. No job, Dekiru. Was it strange that Dekiru's first taste of the incredible realism offered by Infinite Dendrogram was the horrifyingly real feeling of plummeting to his death? As he was falling at incredible speeds, screaming all the way, a small part of his mind couldn't help but appreciate the perfectly simulated sensation of skydiving without a parachute, before it joined the rest of his mind in terrified screaming. He could feel the wind whipping through his hair, the chill of the altitude he was falling from, and even the slight stinging caused by air resistance. It was exactly like falling in reality, which meant he could probably still become a blood-stained mess on the ground if he somehow didn't find a way to break his fall. Dekiru began to think frantically, his mind racing, as the ground began to get closer and closer, until his eyes widened in realization and then he just gave up, going limp in the air as his body kept falling. It seemed like he had given up, but it was actually Dekiru coming to a certain conclusion that led to that choice of action, although it was still incredibly nerve-wracking. Before he could back out of his own plan, he hit the ground, and merely bounced once before falling on the short grass. He stood up shakily, wobbling, before placing his hand on a nearby tree to steady himself, wiping a hand across his forehead to remove the sweat that had gathered there. Then his eyes widened again, and he took a look at his sweat-covered hand in amazement. This kind of realism is incredible. Indeed, the fact that he was actually able to sweat already spoke volumes, but this level of simulation was beyond anything he could have ever dreamed of. Could VR technology have really come so far? Because he honestly thought he would have heard about it if current technology was able to produce this level of simulation. Putting that in the back of his mind for the time being, Dekiru patted down his clothes and checked over his cloak and bodysuit to find that, like he suspected, he was completely unharmed. In mid-flight, he had reasoned that there was no way the first thing a player would experience was death. That would have been a pretty dumb move on the part of the developers, and if the realism was anything to go by, the developers of Infinite Dendrogram were clearly not fools. So he'd suspected that maybe the fall was just a way to get new players to their starting nation without just teleporting them there. And the fact that he was alive only confirmed that his thesis was right. Instead of immediately trying to find his friend, Dekiru first took a moment and sat back against the trees, his sharp, emerald eyes scanning the surroundings as far as the eye could see. And so, he got his first look at the Drife Imperium, which was visible on the horizon. Or more accurately, the capital city, Vandalheim. A huge metal wall ringed the city like a boundary, and within, several different types of building could be seen, with even a few pseudo-skyscrapers. Factories belched black smoke up to the heavens in different corners of the city, but it was the massive steel structure at the center of the city that drew his attention. He couldn't make out any details, but it was really impressive from where he was looking. Could it be a palace of some kind? This was a nation called the Drife Imperium, and this was the capital city, so it stood to reason that the tallest, most impressive building would be a palace. By his guess, that was where he had to go in order to meet Francesca. But Cheshire's last words to him wouldn't quite leave his mind. You can become a hero or the demon king, a king or SLV, a good person or an evil person. You can do something, or you can do nothing. You can stay in Infinite Dendrogram, or leave it. It's all up to you. If it's possible, then you can do anything you want. Just like the Embryo on your left hand, what's about to begin is infinite in possibility. Those words had sunken into his core, and he began to understand just why Infinite Dendrogram was so popular, and why Francesca had insisted that he play it. This was a world unbound by the shackles of their reality. People could become anything they wanted to hear, without heeding things like finance, social status, quirk status, etc. And for him, this was a world where he was born equal to the other players, or masters as they were called in the game. He wasn't quirkless here. He wasn't weaker than anyone else. This was a place where one's own effort led to power gain. While there were a few things based on luck, that was mostly for things like boss encounters and the like. His old dream might not be as far-fetched as he had once thought. With a smile on his face and a soaring heart, Izuku began the trek down the hill he was on, heading for the bustling city on the horizon. Dekiru didn't have to be intelligent to know that he had gotten horribly lost. Francesca hadn't told him where to meet up with her, plus he had no idea how she had designed her avatar, because he didn't think she would choose something as similar to her real body as he had done for his own avatar. He had gotten past the gates with no problem once the guards saw that he was a master. One of them even ruffled his hair, which caused him to blush awkwardly and scoot away into the city. And then it took him approximately 5 seconds to get lost in that huge city. It was odd in the sense that Vandalheim seemed futuristic, but at the same time had a look and feel similar to an industrial-age English city. The technology certainly seemed to be at least on the same level as their own, maybe even superior in some areas, as he had noticed the soldiers equipped with ultramodern weaponry and some even piloted armored suits which he'd overheard being called a martial. In his personal opinion, the design didn't look that great, considering that it looked more like clunky power armor than a seamless exosuit like the kind he personally liked in sci-fi fiction. but it didn't change the fact that walking around Vandalheim was certainly an experience. He walked along quietly, covering his body with his cloak, lost in awe as he studied the surrounding and, most importantly, observed the people. He'd been looking at the back of their hands to search for the crest that identified one as a master, but to his surprise, the people having animated conversations in the street and going about their business were NPCs. It was nothing short of incredible. He'd yet to actually talk to anyone, but that was mainly because he still wasn't much of a social butterfly. He tended to avoid people unless they were heroes, due to his own experiences growing up, and as such had no experience in the field of interpersonal social contact. In fact, Francesca had been the first girl he had ever talked to outside of his mother and his teachers, and boy, had that been an experience. The funny thing was that unlike many people in Japan, Dekiru actually knew French, so the language barrier was much less of a problem between the two of them compared to anyone else. Both of them looked back on their first conversation and often shared a laugh, although Dekiru hadn't really gotten much better socially. Francesca was a soft-spoken person with an iron core, but wasn't the kind of person to tease others needlessly unless they were her enemies. Then she would tear them down mercilessly, but if you were on her good side, she was a pleasant person. If she had been any different, Dekiru didn't think they'd have become such good friends so fast. The fact that she was able to understand his personality and demeanor, as well as respond properly in kind, was the reason they got along so well, despite having almost nothing in common. Anyways, he didn't know any of these people. Even if his quirklessness was no longer something that held him back on the social ladder, years of habit couldn't be broken that easily. Unlike many people, Dekiru, or Izuku Midori in the other world, wasn't the kind of person who would create a new personality and use his avatar to hide his true nature. Both in Infinite Dendrogram and the real world, he would behave the exact same way. Which is why, when he heard a cry for help, Dekiru couldn't stop himself from rushing towards the source. The sight he found before him was an odd one. "Somebody stop that thing," cried a man, as what looked like a mutated pig rammed into a building in the street, dismissive of the chaos it was leaving in its wake. For a moment, Dekiru felt bad for the pig, until he saw its tusks shear through brick and metal, collapsing the wall it had run into. People were running from the frenzied pig, which according to the words floating above its head, was a frenzy boar. True to its name, its eyes were glowing red and it was frothing from the mouth like a rabid animal. Which it probably was. The chaos had to have been recent, as there was no way that a nation like Drife would let something like this go unresolved in the capital city itself for more than a few minutes. So all Dekiru had to do was just wait for the authorities to show up and stop that thing. At level 0, he didn't stand a ghost of a chance against that thing. There were probably lots of masters who could deal with something like that anyways, if the authorities weren't strong enough to stop the pig. After all, the game had been out for a while now. Drife surely had a hefty number of powerful masters who could resolve the situation. All these thoughts were driven away from his mind when he saw a young child and a porcupine in the path of the frenzy boar's stampede. The kid had scraped his knee and was frozen with fear, while the porcupine seemed all right, liking an ice cream cone that was nestled between its claws, and didn't even seem to be paying attention to the carnage surrounding it. There was no way anyone could reach them in time. Just like before, the heroes couldn't help these people. Izuku Midoriya couldn't be a hero. He'd found that out firsthand, and had given up on that train of thought, choosing to follow the path his talents led him down. But Dekiru certainly could be. Just like before, his body moved on its own, just as the frenzy boar noticed the two beings that weren't budging from their spots, making them easy pickings. The boy whimpered in fright, while the porcupine nonchalantly liked its ice cream cone. The boar's eyes glowed red as it charged forwards, intent on skewering the two. In its maddened state, it couldn't feel the aura of overwhelming power that came from the little porcupine. It began to charge, causing the porcupine to look up, bored, and raise a single claw. That one action would have spelled the doom of the frenzy boar. It would have been nearly atomized by the little porcupine's attack, and suffer a most horrifying death. But surprisingly enough, its life was saved by the one trying to protect the people it was attacking. Dekiru threw his staff at the frenzy boar, which did almost no damage, but caused the boar to swerve slightly from its chosen path. Right after that, he threw himself forwards at the boy and the porcupine, and scooped up both of them into his arms as he narrowly avoided the boar's charge, which carried it straight into another wall, eliciting more screams. Dekiru himself hit another wall, which was one of the ones destroyed by the boar before he had gotten there, but made sure that his back was shielding the child and the animal in his arms from injury, causing him to grunt as he still felt the force of smashing into the damaged wall back first. The action had cost him nearly 3/4 of his HP, throwing his health bar dangerously close to red. Dekiru quickly looked down and saw that the child had fainted from the terror of the whole thing, while the porcupine was looking up at him curiously. Looking into its beady eyes, Dekiru couldn't help but feel that this thing was way more intelligent than it let on. The fact that it had been eating an ice cream cone properly did indicate that, but he wasn't completely sure about it until he took a good look at it. He picked it up gently and looked it over once to make sure that it wasn't harmed. He tried to place it down after affirming that it hadn't sustained any injuries, but for some reason, the porcupine had decided to latch on tightly to his arm and refused to let go. Seeing the destroyed ice cream cone on the ground, Dekiru guessed what it could have wanted. "I'll buy you another cone," he promised, and he could have sworn the porcupine's eyes widened in surprise before it climbed up his arms with surprising speed and nestled in his hair. Unfortunately, he wasn't out of the woods yet. The frenzy boar recovered from the force of its last charge, and its furious gaze fixed angrily on the being in green hat had dared to throw a stick at it. Dekiru realized with both grim certainty and a slight sense of satisfaction that he was now the target of its rage. This was good because it meant that no one else was in danger. This was also really bad because it meant he was in danger. Well, there was nothing he could do about it now except trying to survive. As the frenzy boar pawed the ground angrily, Dekiru's eyes began to dart from side to side, looking for any possible solution to his predicament. And then he found one. As the frenzy boar began to charge, Dekiru began to charge in the same direction. This was a strategy that none of the onlookers and the boar itself could understand. This particular frenzy boar was very young, but like the rest of its kind, had stats comparable to a demi-dragon-class monster when it activated the unique skill of its species, Berserk. There was no way a level 0 without an active Embryo could get in close to it and escape alive. But Dekiru hadn't been planning to get close and escape. What he'd planned was something else entirely. As he ran forwards, he suddenly jerked sharply to the left, causing him to avoid the frenzy boar's charge once more by a hair's breadth. His cloak was torn slightly as it went by, but he was left unharmed, and was able to get to the item he'd been gunning for. A sack of pitted apricots, which he had noticed earlier when looking around. One of the first buildings the frenzy boar had crashed into happened to be a grocery store of some kind, and the contents of said building had gotten scattered about in the carnage. There were two parts to his plan, and both of them were based on observations he had made at that moment. As the boar turned to look at him again, pulling itself out of the rubble of its latest crash site, Dekiru noticed that its eyes weren't glowing red. This was his second observation. The boar was obviously using some kind of ability to make itself stronger and angrier. That much could be discerned from the name itself. However, the skill would get disrupted momentarily the instant it crashed into something, no doubt from the concussive force of the impact. This was what he'd been banking on. He held an apricot from the bag, his face set in a determined expression. He was incredibly, almost scarily calm at that moment, and showed no fear whatsoever. The boar took a look at him and sniffed the air. It slowly began to trot forward, but Dekiru didn't even flinch. Instead, he rolled the apricot along the ground towards the approaching beast. It rolled to a stop at the hooves of the frenzy boar, which wasted no time in eating it up. Just as he'd planned, when presented with a delicious treat like that, it began to lose its aggression and came closer for more treats. As it was no longer using its berserk skill, its baser instincts now had a greater modicum of control over its body, meaning that it couldn't ignore free food. As it was now almost in front of him and he was now out of danger, Dekiru took a closer look at the beast. It was rather large for a boar, probably because it was a monster, and had pitch-black fur with strange purple markings on its face and along its hide. Its eyes, now that they weren't besieged by its madness-inducing skill, were yellow and slotted. Something about the boar made it look somewhat lonely, so Dekiru petted it on the head, earning a grunt from the now placid creature. By the time Dekiru had fed it 2 more apricots, it had reached where he was standing and was looking up at him expectantly. Dekiru let out an uneasy smile before holding out another apricot. The frenzy boar studied him for a few moments, before gently accepting the fruit, and Dekiru visibly deflated in relief when he got a message stating that he had tamed the frenzy boar. That didn't stop him from turning beet red in embarrassment when everyone who had been watching began to cheer. Dekiru was eating a mint chip ice cream cone while the porcupine from earlier was sitting right next to him and scarfing down some rocky road. It had been a couple of minutes since the incident with the frenzy boar, and things had settled down. The owner of the boar, who ran a shop for tameable creatures, had apologized to him profusely before giving him 1,000 Valis and some EXP boosters as compensation for his deeds, which he tried to refuse vehemently, but was shut down as always. Dekiru had given the boar back, as it was still somewhat scary to him even though he had tamed it, and because it wasn't his to begin with. He had been thanked by many people, from the police to the mother of the child he had saved, and Dekiru could honestly say that there was no way the people of this world could be anything other than real. Their expressions, their words, and their gratitude, none of those things were fake or artificial. The whole time, he felt like he had been talking to real people. When he'd bashfully thanked them for their kind words, earning him more than a few os, and in a few cases, blushes and nosebleeds, and had walked away to get the porcupine some ice cream, Dekiru wondered if Infinite Dendrogram was really just a game. There was no way something like this could be created by simple ones and zeros. The thought had lingered on his mind even when he'd gotten to the ice cream shop they were near at the moment and bought some ice cream for both himself and the porcupine. After all the excitement he had been through already, he felt like he could use some. Speaking of which, the porcupine had been silently observing him the whole time from its perch in his hair, almost as if scrutinizing him. It had gratefully accepted the ice cream from him and had even selected which flavor it wanted, which only confirmed his theory about it being smarter than it had let on. Now they sat together in companionable silence, eating ice cream together like old friends. When they'd finished, Dekiru stood up to leave, before looking back at the porcupine, which was likewise looking at him. "I have to go meet up with a friend of mine," said Dekiru kindly, knowing that the porcupine could understand him pretty well. "Is there someone you need to go back to?" The porcupine looked at him for a few seconds, before shaking its head and jumping onto his arm, running up to his shoulder and then climbed up to his head, before retaking its perch. He sweat dropped at that, but reasoned that it couldn't be helped. He could ask Francesca about it later. But where could he find her? "You never change, do you, Izu?" asked a masculine voice behind him, and Izuku turned abruptly to see a tall, whitish blonde-haired man in a lab coat, with black gloves that were exposed on the area over his left hand, revealing a crest and marking him as a master. But how did this guy even know his name? "Wait a minute. F. Francesca?" he asked incredulously, receiving a wide grin in return. "It's Franklin in Dendro," she said, snorting at the scandalized look on his face. "Hey, not all of us decide to go with a barely modified version of our real bodies as our avatar." Dekiru blushed at that, scratching the back of his head nervously. "I guess you're right," he said before falling into step with her as she began to walk away. "But you were right. Infinite Dendrogram is amazing." Franklin smiled at his enthusiasm. "I thought you'd think so. It's a pretty amazing place, and you haven't even seen more than an inch of it." She stopped for a moment to look at him sternly through her glasses. "But I see you've been busy, even if it's only been an hour or so since you arrived here. Taking on and taming a frenzy boar at level 0 without an Embryo to save a kid? Honestly, how do you even stumble upon these things? You're like this IRL too. Are you a trouble magnet or something?" "I have the right to remain silent." "Thought so," said Franklin with a smirk at his embarrassed face. "Oh, by the way," said Dekiru, pointing at the porcupine nestled in his hair. "Have you seen this porcupine before?" Franklin's gaze turned upwards, and made eye contact with the master nestled in Dekiru's hair before nearly choking on her spit, looking at her longtime friend incredulously for a few moments before bursting into resigned laughter. "Only you," she said, wiping imaginary tears. Dekiru was very confused. He'd only asked her a simple question, yet she had displayed a broad spectrum of emotions before stopping at insane laughter. It was really off-putting. That porcupine in your hair isn't a real porcupine. She's a master, actually. You probably haven't heard of her since you started playing today, but she has the highest kill ranking in Drife. Meet Behemoth, King of Beasts, the physically strongest master in the world and Drife's most powerful player and superior. Slowly, Dekiru's eyes roamed upwards and he made eye contact with the suddenly much more terrifying porcupine on his head. "Hi," she said, waving a claw at him. Dekiru fainted. "Giga Professor, Mr. Franklin." Knowing the standard Midoriya response to these kinds of situations, Franklin had already bent forward and caught the boy before he could fall on the ground. She gently leaned him against the bench, before turning to look at Behemoth, her gaze sharpening. "You know, I promised his mother that I wouldn't let him get involved with shady characters. And that's basically you to AT. So tell me, King of Beasts, what's your game here? Don't play dumb. My analyzing eye of wisdom's already seen through you. I bet your Embryo isn't too far away from here either," she said, adjusting her glasses with a harsh glare. Despite her calm demeanor, she was on edge. Franklin knew there was no way in hell she could defeat the King of Beasts. Not only was she a non-combat build, but her Embryo was only in Form 4 and had no chance of standing up to whatever monster of a superior Embryo that Behemoth possessed. But she still had to ascertain her intentions towards for Izuku. Franklin, or Francesca Gautier, was a person who had seen more horrible people than she'd ever cared to see in her life. She'd been born into a wealthy family, but that didn't mean she was happy. Her father was a dreadful man, and her mother was a spineless coward who could do nothing against him. She held nothing against her younger sister Yuri for not being able to help her, because it would be dumb to hold that against her when she was barely into her teens. In fact, Yuri was the only light in her life, and even their father didn't dare try his games with her. But still, Francesca and her mother suffered in silence, her mother unwilling to do anything and herself unable to do anything. That was when she began to hate pro-heroes. They promised to save everyone and help people, but once her father waved a few euros in their face, they were putty in his hands and ignored the suffering that was going on right in front of their eyes. Franklin had learned that the world was a horrible place, and even the people closest to you could be the worst of monsters. She'd seen that firsthand with her father, and had suffered under his cruelty along with her mother for years, until the day he'd destroyed her creations, her treasured memories from the times she spent with her grandfather, saying that they would scare away the husband he'd dredged up for her to marry. She'd inherited her quirk, animation, from her grandfather, and the kindly old man had spent years teaching her how to use it in order to create beautiful works of art. This chain of events had happened due to the death of their pet iguana, Dylan. Her grandfather had shown her the potential of her quirk by creating a plaster replica and animating it, making it look as if Dylan had never left them. She began to work tirelessly, and by the time her grandfather passed away, she'd already surpassed him in skill. After he died, she'd worked tirelessly to create as much as she could using her quirk, both in his memory and because she loved doing it. And her father had destroyed all that she'd created, without even batting an eye, and demanded that she become a trophy wife to some high-ranking French pro-hero. It was then that Francesca finally snapped. She decided that she wasn't going to marry some pro-hero her father had bribed into matrimony. She wasn't going to be anyone's pawn. This was her life to live, and she made the rules. Not her father. Not anyone else. She'd walked out thoroughly done with the world. She left the lavish but miserable life she'd once lived behind, and had decided to begin a new one. She was incredibly smart and talented in the fields of science and technology, and had applied for Island University, to which she had been accepted. Things seemed to finally be looking up for her, until she'd been taken hostage in a villain attack. With the man's razor nails against her neck, she felt fear again, and since her state of mind wasn't optimal, her quirk failed her. It looked like she was going to die, alone in a grocery store as the victim of a random villain attack. That was when Izuku Midoriya crashed into her life. He'd nearly died saving her, and had been rushed away to the hospital once the GodMed heroes got their heads out of there as and began to use their brains. Unwilling to just leave him to that fate after he'd saved her life, Francesca had followed after him, and had met Inko Midoriya. This woman was everything that her mother wasn't. She wasn't rich. She didn't have an illustrious background. But she had a spirit of steel, the same spirit her son had inherited. She was a strong woman, who had raised a quirkless son on her own and gave him a comfortable life that few people with his status had. She had a backbone, a strength that Leia Gautier never had. She had her regrets, yes, but those didn't force her to ignore the plight of her child. Even though she'd shed tears when she heard of her son's condition, she remained strong and proud, and even told off the pro-heroes who had the nerve to tell her that her son shouldn't have interfered in their rescue in the first place. That was something her mother could never do. After Izuku had recovered, the Midoriyas had taken her in, and for the first time since her grandfather had died, Francesca Gautier felt like she'd finally found a true home. The two of them were possibly the purest people on the planet. When she'd left for Island a week later, Francesca had to physically force herself to leave. However, she still had a goal: to free her sister from their father's clutches before it was too late. And to do that she needed to go to Island and complete her education. That thought was what gave her the strength to leave the Midoriyas, but she resolved to protect them with everything she had. They'd taken up a place in her heart that had been left vacant for a long time. This was why she couldn't help but be worried about Dekiru's penchant of attracting trouble. Not much was known about Behemoth, that was true, but Franklin knew that there was no way players like her would hang around Dekiru without some kind of motive. It wasn't his fault, but he was a newbie who'd started playing that very day. So what could Behemoth possibly want from him? Francesca didn't know, and especially in her Franklin persona, she hated not knowing things. Especially when it involved the few people she cared for. Just as she'd guessed, a beautiful blue-haired woman walked out of a nearby shop, and Franklin didn't need her superior job skill in order to feel the nearly visible bloodlust she was giving off. She looked like a normal adventurer and even had a crest on her left hand, but Franklin's analytical eye of wisdom could see through fake ones like it. Franklin paled when her skill showed just what kind of monster Leviathan really was. Name: Queen of Beasts, Leviathan. Type: Maiden with Guardian. Form: 7. Status: HP 23,650,050. Visor: Estia 216,900. AGI 210,059. End 232,020. Dex 1,058. Book 100. DMN. Is this the power of a superior Embryo? This only reaffirmed that there was no way Franklin could win in a fight, even if she had the tactical advantage and time to prepare. Sure, Behemoth's stats were marginally larger, but for her Embryo's stats to be that high was ridiculous, especially when one considered that Leviathan was a type guardian who could operate independently. To put it simply, Behemoth possessed a level of power which made any tactic useless. With that kind of AGI, Leviathan herself could break the sound barrier at least twice over before Franklin could even blink. "What's the hold-up, Fran? Did you find him?" asked a cheerful voice from behind her. Franklin remained calm as an attractive young woman walked up next to her. She appeared to be in her 20s with red hair and silver highlights. She also had heterochromia, with her left eye being red and her right eye silver. She was voluptuous, wearing a flight jacket, hot pants, and a bikini top. She gave off a rather carefree aura, in sharp contrast to Franklin herself. Even though her arrival didn't improve their chance of victory by even a fraction of a percent, Franklin still felt reassured by the presence of one of her best friends, Eric. The two of them had started playing Infinite Dendrogram together by coincidence, and they had become fast friends, close enough to exchange information about their real lives. Leia took one look at the knocked-out boy on the bench and squealed, completely ignoring the tension between Franklin and the two extremely powerful beings standing across from her. "Ah," she cried excitedly, picking him up with ease and examining him. "He's even more adorable in person." Franklin immediately knew what her friend had done. While pretending to ignore the conflict and acting as she normally would, he had put herself in a position where she could grab him and run in case it became necessary. That was one of the things Franklin liked about her. She didn't need her Embryos' near-prophetic powers to understand a situation. With a small smirk at her friend's antics and inwardly praying that Dekiru remained unconscious so that he didn't immediately faint again once he saw the woman manhandling him, Franklin addressed the godlike porcupine, completely ignoring Leviathan. "I'll ask again," she said calmly. "What do you want with Dekiru? You wouldn't have stuck around if there wasn't something you had in mind." To me have been a little too paranoid, but someone as antisocial as Behemoth was someone she couldn't get a proper read on. And like she'd thought earlier, Dekiru tended to attract trouble, both in this world and their own. Someone like Behemoth who sat on a mountain of corpses to reach new heights of glory couldn't possibly be good news. It may have been only a video game, but she'd be mad if she would let someone ruin Infinite Dendrogram for her friend, superior or not. Leviathan growled at that, her pupils turning into slits. "Watch your tone, weakling," said Leviathan. "My master's interests are her own to share if she feels like it. Do not interfere when you lack the strength for such a task." Each word was punctuated by a pulse of pounding bloodlust, to the point where the birds in the surrounding area, as scanty as they were, flew off, terrified by the presence of a creature that went beyond the standard definition of an apex predator. Franklin couldn't help the bead of sweat that rolled down her temple, but only one thought crossed her mind at that moment. Why was it always him who got into these kinds of situations? As the veins on Leviathan's face began to bulge and her hands began morphing into claws, almost quite literally radiating a murderous aura, did her master speak up. "Know your place and shut your mouth," the porcupine suddenly said, irritation present in her tone. The superior Embryo flinched and bowed her head in her master's direction. "My apologies," she said. "Please pardon my abusive thoughts. I almost let them out, but I'll hold them back now." "K," said Behemoth before turning back to Franklin, who was watching the byplay between the two. "He's like me," said Behemoth, oddly subdued, and speaking in normal words. "He's quirkless too." "How did you dash?" "You can call it intuition," said the physical apex, tapping her claws on the bench. "But the signs aren't that hard to miss. I haven't met anyone like me, even in Infinite Dendrogram. Not to say that quirkless people don't play at all, but the numbers are still incredibly low. After all, the whole 20% population thing is a sham. 19% of the quirkless population are either 50 or older. The number of quirkless kids in a city can be counted on one hand, and that number keeps dropping. Suicide, murder, abuse. The reasons are endless. That's why I wanted to be friends with him, because he's lonely, just like I was before I got Leia. Franklin sighed at that, adjusting her glasses, while remained silent, her normally cheerful face somewhat dour. Leviathan looked murderous, but that anger wasn't aimed at them, but was more likely about the way her master must have lived thanks to being quirkless. After all, maidens could supposedly see their master's memories. Thankfully, her bloodlust was under control this time, though she still looked like she wanted to kill something. Still, the tension in the atmosphere had disappeared, but it was slightly depressing now. "You're right," said Franklin. "What his life has been like IRL is his story to tell, not mine, but everything you said definitely applies to him. He's a nice person, too nice in fact, and he's suffered his whole life for it. I apologize for being rather aggressive, but he's one of the only people I can call family, and his safety is my top priority." "And chittered Behemoth, slowly reverting back to her usual method of speech. "Family is important." "He'll wake up in a few minutes," said Franklin, running a hand through her hair with a sigh. "What do you say we get some of that rumored specialty coffee that the guys at the Gourmet Gear keep bragging about? Get hype." Franklin took that as a yes. No job, Dekiru. Fainting in Infinite Dendrogram was certainly an experience. According to the message he had gotten before he blacked out, fainting was actually a status effect in the game. When one fainted, they would be taken to a sort of mental waiting room until the debuff wore off. So Dekiru sat there in the darkness for what felt like around 20 minutes, until suddenly everything disappeared in a flash of light and he blinked himself awake, feeling rather disoriented. He opened his eyes and was met with the sight of Behemoth the not porcupine drinking coffee next to Francesca and two women he hadn't seen before. One had blue hair and seemed to be rather polished in appearance, while the other wore rather daring clothes and seemed much more enthusiastic and carefree. "Oh look," said the carefree woman with a rather teasing grin. "Sleeping cuties awake now." Dekiru pulled the cloak over his head as he blushed furiously, trying to forget the shameful event from earlier. Sorry," he said, apologizing to Behemoth. "Why, you surprised me." "Oh." Behemoth didn't seem to mind. "Well, Izu, now that all the excitement's over, I might as well tell you now," said Franklin, putting down her coffee before raising her arms theatrically in a manner befitting a mad scientist. She was really getting into her mad scientist role-playing. "Welcome to Vandalheim, capital of Drife, and to Infinite Dendrogram as a whole." "Yay," said Behemoth in agreement. "Gain strength and stand among the strongest this world has to offer. Then we will fight to the death in glorious combat," said the blue-haired woman seriously, her expression breaking into a bloodthirsty grin that seemed way less refined than her appearance, before Behemoth smacked her with a claw to curb her behavior. "Just kick back and have fun," said the other one, laughing at their antics. "You can do whatever you want to do over here." He kind of got that from Cheshire's speech, but he was still grateful that there were nice people willing to encourage him. "Ahem," said Franklin, clearing her throat. "Well, we should probably get down to business and help get you set up." She took out a rather large book from her inventory and set it down on the table. On it was the title, The Suitable Job Diagnostics Catalog. "The way Infinite Dendrogram works, you'll be stuck at level 0 unless you get a job. You can already guess what that is. There are 3 categories of jobs one can have: low rank, high rank, and superior. Low-rank jobs have a level cap of 50 and tend to be more easily accessible and have few prerequisite conditions to unlock them. You can get a maximum of 6 low-rank jobs. Low-rank jobs, surprisingly enough, tend to have the most skills, though they're usually pretty basic." The heterochromic woman on Franklin's right decided to continue for her. "High-rank jobs are a tad bit more difficult to get and tend to have 1 or 2 conditions you have to meet before you can get them. They tend to have an ultimate skill, which is usually pretty wild, and have a level cap of 100, but you can only have 2 of them total, so you have to be smart about what you pick. Oh, and by the way, you can get jobs from the respective job crystals." Finally, the blue-haired woman holding Behemoth spoke up. "Superior jobs are among the greatest of powers this world has to offer. A superior job is an extremely rare find, and usually possesses several difficult unlock conditions, and a quest that one has to take in order to access the job crystal for it. Once a superior job has been claimed, no one else can get it unless the previous holder dies, which is impossible for masters. As you can imagine, they also have ultimate skills. My master, Behemoth, possesses the superior job King of Beasts, which is from the Jaguar Man grouping. Similarly," said Franklin, "I possess the superior job Giga Professor from the Researcher grouping, while ARIC here has the superior job the Ace from the Pilot grouping. A jobs grouping is important because you can only use skills from jobs of the same grouping. For example, since my main job is Giga Professor, if I replaced one of my other jobs with something like Warrior, I wouldn't be able to use its skills because it's from a different grouping. Makes sense?" Dekiru was quiet for a few moments. "I think we laid it on him too fast," said A, concerned. "Nonsense," said Franklin, waving it off. "He's smart enough to get into Island Academy a year early in 2 different courses. This kind of thing is child's play for him. Analyzing things is something he excels in." Exclamation point, chirped Behemoth, surprised. Brice whistled. "Huh, that's pretty impressive." "That's amazing," said Dekiru, his eyes shining. "There are so many possible combinations that one can take. And I can't believe all 3 of you have superior jobs." Then he looked to Leviathan. "You're in bio, aren't you, miss? A type guardian, maybe?" Leviathan blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "I still have my crest disguise on." "You referred to Behemoth as your master, and she seems to have some level of authority over you. I also thought it made sense from bios to be able to disguise themselves as masters if they could operate independently. It would fool enemies into thinking there are more masters and more bios," said Dekiru, before sheepishly rubbing his head. "Sorry about that. I just couldn't help but notice it." Franklin snorted at that. Understatement of the century. You really need to control your habit of vomiting information at people, Dekiru, said Franklin, before she was elbowed by Aric. Hypocrite. You do exactly the same thing. XD. Behemoth let out a chirping noise that was actually somewhat irritating. Your assumption is correct, in all except one part. My name is Leviathan, a type maiden with Guardian Superior Embryo. My master is, as you guessed, Behemoth, said the blue-haired woman. Leia, squeaked Behemoth, causing her Embryo to nod. Please refer to me as Leia. Type maiden? Asked Dekiru curiously. Is that one of the extra Embryo categories? Yep, said Franklin, who was rubbing her ribs. It's really rare though. In fact, there are only 3 in the whole of the Drife Imperium, and less than 100 out of all the masters in the game. But we can worry more about that when your Embryo hatches. Let's get you settled with a job first. She gestured to the thick book she had placed on the table. Tada! The suitable job diagnostics catalog, she said in a voice as if she was talking about some sort of secret weapon. What he did pull out, though, was a thick book. If you read this catalog, you can find the job that best fits you out of all the ones you can equip right now. That's useful, murmured Dekiru. Since the format is a questionnaire, I don't know if it'll really be the best fit, but this'll work just fine when you're not sure what to do. Franklin continued. Because at any rate, there are over 100 low-rank jobs that you can equip in this city from the beginning. That's way too many, cried Dekiru in surprise. Obviously, he'd known there would be many jobs, thanks to what knowledge he had of games that used a job or class system, but to have over 100 job choices right off the bat as a starting job was something he had never heard of. Exactly. I know that you can probably chart out your own job build once you start browsing the wiki IRL, but for now you should just take the catalog's advice. If you don't like the job you're saddled with, you can always just reset it at a save point. Well, okay then, said Dekiru quietly, opening the catalog and beginning the questionnaire. And so, after a few minutes the results came in. A druid? Dekiru said aloud, curious but also rather interested. The 3 women and 1 female porcupine all blinked at that, Franklin tapping her chin in thought. That's a rather uncommon job, even in its native kingdom of Legendaria. The druid job is a caster type which focuses on unique terrain support and buffs. As such, it's not a job that can be used easily, even if it's strong. It's sort of like how different characters in an MMORPG have different difficulty levels for players trying to master them. Unique terrain support? Like environmental alteration? Asked Dekiru. Maybe. I haven't met any people with the job, so I can't say. I thought it was Legendaria exclusive, like how the engineer and mechanic jobs are Drife exclusive. Druid seem like something more up the alley of that fantasy kingdom. Nope, chittered Behemoth, shaking her head. Master is correct, elaborated Leviathan. There is one job crystal that has the druid job here in Drife, that was excavated recently in the same area where the Jaguarman job crystals were discovered. I think I hear about that, said A, turning her head. Sapful? Yay. Correct. The druid grouping job crystal is located in the Sapful ruins to the immediate southwest of the city, said Leviathan. It's a relatively safe area, so there shouldn't be any problems with monsters. Then let's go there immediately. I'm taking a break from the project anyway. You coming at? Said Franklin, dusting off her lab coat and standing up. I got nothing else to do. And I suppose you two will be tagging along as well? Yep. Indeed. Then let's go. You ready, Dekiru? Yes. The Sapful ruins were the remains of the center of a city belonging to a certain tribe of Teons, as the NPCs, native to Infinite Dendrogram were called. They were the home of the lost job grouping, the Jaguarman, the only legacy left behind by that extinct tribe. These ruins were excavated by the Drife Imperium around the time Infinite Dendrogram released on Earth, and the lost job became available again. As the Jaguarman Guardian build was very popular among masters, the ruins were secured, and as a natural dungeon, didn't have respawning monsters, which meant once the area was cleared out, there was a good chance that it would remain relatively peaceful as the monsters moved away to safer hunting grounds. It was there that the rather unusual party of 3 superior job holders, a superior MBio and a level 0 newbie had gone to in order to get said newbie his first jobs. Currently, they stood in front of a giant crystal, which was glowing dimly in the light, a little deep into the ruins. "This is the Druid job crystal," said Leviathan. "While you can switch between jobs you already have using portable job crystals or at save points, to actually get a new job you need to interact with the corresponding crystal," said Franklin helpfully. "Now go ahead and get your first job." "So, do I just touch it?" asked Dekiru, curiously. "Yep." He reached out and tapped the crystal gently, and then a list popped up, allowing him to select a job. There were only 3 options: Druid, Wild Druid, and High Druid. The first one was the one he was looking for, while the other 2 were the high-rank jobs of the Druid grouping, or at least the ones available on this particular job crystal, and were predictably grayed out since he had not fulfilled whatever job conditions existed for them. That only left one real choice. The moment his finger touched the option, there was an almost imperceptible flash of light, and Dekiru received a message stating he had received the job. Sure enough, when he pulled up his window, the main job slot in his status now read Druid. "Well, that settles that," said Franklin with an easy grin, probably reminiscing about the time she got her first job as well. Behemoth seemed to be lost in nostalgia as well, although it was hard to tell the expressions of a porcupine, and Leviathan seemed content that her master was at peace, though she herself looked bored. Though by now, Dekiru knew that Leviathan's personality was far more bloodthirsty than she let on, so it probably wasn't unusual. "Friend us, won't you?" asked hugging him and ruffling his hair. "Alright," said Dekiru, flustered by the close contact, but sound enough in mind to add Behemoth, Franklin, and Day to his friends list. The sad part was that this list had more friends than he had ever made in his whole life, and he had met 2 of the people on it only an hour or so before. "So when will I unlock my bio?" asked Dekiru, looking at the crimson-colored Zeroth form bio on his hand. "That seems like the only important thing a player needs, apart from a job." "Yeah, you're right about that. Your tutorial hasn't ended until you unlock your bio. There's no actual set way of activating an bio, but they usually hatch within a few hours of playtime, and even faster if the master is in danger," chirped Behemoth, before jumping on his head so fast he nearly missed it, and dangling a small object in front of his head. A window came up over it with the item description. "A life-saving brooch?" he muttered curiously, not noticing Leviathan's expression shift into a toothy grin while A and Franklin seemed to gain some sort of horrified realization. Then Behemoth launched herself off of his head, then twisted in midair, and streaked back towards him, her deadly claws aimed at his throat. Dekiru knew that he wouldn't be able to move in time. Even though Behemoth had obviously slowed herself, since he could actually perceive her attack, he was still way too slow to respond. All within the span of a second, a cold feeling settled in his gut, amidst a whirlwind of rapid emotions. The claws coming closer to him caused him to remember that feeling, on that fateful day he met Francesca, when he had stopped that nail-quirked villain, nearly at the cost of his own life. The feeling of death approaching. However, that feeling hadn't stopped him from acting before, and it wouldn't stop him now. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reflexively moved towards his assailant, his fist rising to meet her. And in response to his unyielding will and determination, the dormant MBio on his left hand erupted in a fountain of dark red light. It had been watching him, studying him, learning about him. Izuku Midoriya. Dekiru. Its master. It had been in a lucid, dreamlike state, like all its kind had been in before they had evolved and hatched from their developmental stage. Until it had been bound to him. Then, as per its function, it broached his mind and began to learn. Data, memories, all began to flow like water, merging with the information all of them were created with. And it began to change, to evolve, as the combined information, derived from both itself and its master, began to flow through it. A world of heroes and villains. Development program, initiated. The society which valued power. Evolution variables, calculated. A young man born without it, who wanted to be a hero as well. Master analysis, initiated. A young man put down by the privileged, those born with power they did not earn. Developmental path, determined. A young man shunned and abused at every turn, confined to the darkness, for a status he had been born into, forever destined to be mocked by the privileged masses who soared above. Conceptual anchor, match found. A young man whose talents would be trampled on by those around him. Resource allocation, complete. A young man who would be an outcast no matter where he went, lacking a place to call his own, a place where he could show his talents on an even playing field. Typing determined, territory rule. A young man who saw the value in the lives of every person he came across, in spite of the torment levied on him. Additional typing determined, maiden. A young man who wished to help people in any way he could. Physical chassis, constructed. A young man who shone like a star in a world that had gone dim. Developmental program, complete. And so, it became a she. By instinct, she knew her master needed her. The time for her awakening was now. He wanted to save others, even at the cost of himself. Who was she to protest against such a noble goal, such a shining representation of her master's heart? No, she would be what her master needed. A companion to embrace him, a weapon against his enemies, and the very earth beneath his feet. As if on cue, she felt a tug, her master's will calling to her. He was in danger. He needed her. And so, she eagerly answered. Name, Queen of the Great Below, Ereshkigal. Druid, Dekiru. The glow from his left hand wasn't enough to distract Dekiru from the deadly porcupine heading straight for his throat. Logically, a small part of his mind affirmed that she wasn't actually trying to hurt him, as she had given him a life-saving brooch earlier, a special item that basically gave a person, master and Tian alike, a second life. However, the more dominant and primitive part of his mind only registered the danger that was Behemoth, physical apex of Infinite Dendrogram and the top of Drife's kill rankings, heading straight for him, emitting enough bloodlust to kill an elephant. However, considering Bakugo's nigh-eternal rage, he'd become quite desensitized to killer intent. He didn't flinch and, instead, reflexively aimed a punch at Behemoth, as futile as it would be. As they grew closer to one another, the crimson light which had begun to build up exploded off of his left hand, a visible shockwave emanating from the dark red crest that was now emblazoned on it, in the shape of a flower, a carnation. A ring of crimson energy formed around his feet before rapidly expanding outwards, causing the landscape around himself in a ring about 5 meters in radius to rapidly lose color, becoming dark and dreary, though the terrain beneath remained the same. And then Dekiru felt power. His veins felt like they'd been injected with double espresso shots. And suddenly his mind began to work at much faster speeds, his body thrumming with energy. As he looked up, he saw that Behemoth was now falling towards him in what looked like slow motion, appearing almost comical, now that he thought about it. His punch missed for that reason, as the now slow-mo Behemoth didn't reach the area he had to strike in time. Reflexively, he pulled back and punched again, idly realizing that his physical speed was on par with his hyperperception. The punch connected. A shockwave of power emanated from the site of impact, stripping the dirt and grass around him, and creating a visible burst of air from where his punch had impacted Behemoth's light body. And then Behemoth disintegrated, the force of his punch pretty much pulverizing every tissue in her body to the point where they were practically atomized. And then the feeling of power immediately faded, and Dekiru was thrown back by the force of his own punch, flying back about a dozen meters. He landed on the ground harshly, taking some damage, but thankfully not enough to kill him. His hyperperception also faded, and he felt like her normally did. Proceeding to wipe the dust and dirt out of his eyes, Dekiru chanced upon the sight of Arise and Franklin, who had also been thrown across the clearing by the force of his punch, staring slack-jawed at the location where he had been a split second prior. Leviathan also had frozen with an expression of incredulous disbelief on her face, right before she burst into a shower of light, disappearing. Dekiru was about to ask what the heck had happened when his window popped up and practically exploded as messages began to roll in, obscuring his vision. He closed his eyes in order to shut out the messages flowing in, feeling his body become stronger and feeling a bit more energetic than he was before. When the ringing from the messages finally stopped a few seconds later, he nearly toppled over again, his body feeling way out of tune as he fought off a sense of vertigo. What happened? He slurred, trying to steady his swimming vision. A strong set of arms supported him and held him upright, and his sight returned to him. He saw that Franklin was supporting him, while Ari was inspecting some fallen objects at the location where he had been blown back from. A few seconds later, she turned back to the two of them, flabbergasted. It's legit. He actually gave her the death penalty. No way, said Franklin wide-eyed. What happened? Asked Dekiru again, this time much more clearly. Franklin looked back down at him, struggling to keep her hysterical laughter in. Why don't you check your messages? Said Franklin, her eyes tearing up as her body began to shake with barely suppressed giggles. Dekiru did so, confused, and his jaw slowly dropped as he looked at the now thankfully summarized messages on his window. Congratulations! You have defeated Behemoth. Main job level increased to 50. Extra EXP will be distributed upon taking your next job. You have unlocked many new skills. Before Dekiru could even process the implications of the message, he received another one, this one from his phone in real life, connected to his Infinite Dendrogram hardware in case he got any calls. Unknown, hex. Unknown, got wrecked. GG. Unknown, keep the loot. Do wait-evs with it. Fee after respawn. While he didn't know the number, the method of speaking gave away who had been contacting him. Also, that solidified the fact that he had somehow killed Behemoth, probably the strongest player in the entire kingdom, in one punch. Oh, and the EXP he had gained from the act had catapulted him to level out of within a few minutes of getting the druid job. He'd completely maxed it out. How in the world? He asked incredulously, not understanding what happened. Then his gaze strayed downward, and he realized that the area around his feet was still discolored, as if it was being seen through a dreary Snapchat filter. His eyes widened. Could it be? In a flash, the ground returned to normal, and a figure materialized in a flash of red light, causing him to squint as it went off in his face. The first thing that Dekiru noticed when his vision cleared was the beautiful, wavy blonde hair. It shone like gold in the orange light of the setting sun. The obsidian crown that adorned the figure's head kept the golden strands from blocking her shining red eyes, which met his own with a warm, slightly adoring gaze. The girl wore a black royal leotard, covered at the bottom by a wavy black skirt, with a dark red cloak with golden inlay wrapped over her shoulders. Further down was a fluffy, conservative neckline, with maroon highlights that adorned much of her outfit, and a golden skull necklace that fell over her voluptuous chest. A silver chain wrapped around the girl's waist like a belt. Her right leg was fully covered by a gold-entwined black legging while the left leg was left relatively bare. Her rosy cheeks reddened slightly as she shyly met his gaze, almost as if seeking his approval, before she straightened and introduced herself to her dumbfounded crowd. I am Queen of the Great Below, Ereshkigal, she proclaimed jubilantly with a smile on her face. A type maiden with territory rule Embryo, I am at your service, my master. Giga Professor, Mr. Franklin. To say she was surprised would be an understatement. Franklin had seen some crazy things, but a level 0 puning the king of beasts was not one of them. It had happened way too fast for her to follow. All of a sudden, the situation reversed, and Dekiru ended up punching the deadly porcupine with enough force to disintegrate her. And then he manifested an Embryo who could honestly be a supermodel. After her introduction, Dekiru seemed to flounder for a moment, something that brought no shortage of amusement to Franklin, who knew her friend quite well. A pretty girl popping up out of nowhere and calling him master would cause him to throw logic out the window and begin panicking. However, his Embryo seemed to sense that, so she wrung her hands rather endearingly and explained herself. It seemed all well and good from there on out, as Dekiru began to learn what exactly was happening and what an Embryo truly was, at least in his case. Franklin only had one thought that crossed her mind as she stared vacantly at the master and his Embryo, while A was still numbly poking the drops from Behemoth, as if they would disappear. What are the odds that he would get a type maiden Embryo? I mean, they're one of the rarest types of Embryos for a reason, said Franklin, trailing off, deep in thought. In the meanwhile, Ereshkigal, acting as a guide for her master, began to give Dekiru more information on herself and her capabilities. She asked him to pull up the newly unlocked Embryo section in his menu first, and then explained from there. All Embryos tend to have a property known as status correction. This is the ability of the Embryo to influence the stat growth of the master. It doesn't always have to be positive, but it is almost always there, except in cases like myself. Lectured Ereshkigal. My own focuses on your health, MP and stamina rather than your physical stats. True to her word, Ereshkigal gave Dekiru a status boost to his MP, HP and SP, and a rather decent amount at that, as even though he had only reached level 50, his MP had already reached 6, his SP was 5,000 and his HP was 4,000, which was rather good for someone of his level. As a type territory rule, when I'm not in my maiden form, I form a field around you that carries the properties of my first skill. In this form, I cannot be hurt, although holy attacks will disperse me temporarily. As you can see, the only skill I have right now is Denial of Authority, which will automatically come into effect when someone enters my territory. Franklin's lips curved into a subtle frown as she watched her longtime friend curiously flick through his window at the behest of his Embryo. She'd been a little dishonest earlier. She knew exactly why he'd gotten a type maiden with territory rule Embryo. Recently, out of curiosity, Franklin had begun looking into some surveys and findings about how a master's Embryo developed based on their personality. With the exception of type chariot Embryos, she more or less had an idea of the others. Type arms usually were owned by people who acted like stereotypical anime protagonists, brash, brave and foolhardy. From her own deduction, Dekiru, being the person he was, had a high chance of developing this type of Embryo. Castle masters were introverted, gentle, careful, cooperative, and had an artisan's temperament. Seemed about right, considering her own Embryo was once a type castle Embryo. Guardian masters were almost the opposite of arms masters. They're cowardly, afraid to get hurt, lonely, or just wanted to have someone protect them. Apart from some special hybrid types and the elusive type apostle, that only left two categories. Coincidentally, the ones Dekiru had just unlocked. Type Maiden and Type Territory. Type Rule, being a special kind of extra type that little was known about except for the fact that they tended to enforce some kind of special property that didn't work based on stat changes or damage, had no data in regards to master character however, leading her to depend on the territory typing for her current analysis. Territory masters had a desire for control, tended to hoard their stress, create rules for themselves, and were self-righteous people and lone wolves. Dekiru, or more accurately, Izuku Midoriya was a brave soul through and through, but one thing dominated his psyche, the unfairness of the world around him. Out of all the common traits that type territory masters shared, Dekiru possessed the first, a desire for control, though not in the sense one would think. Dekiru wanted control over his own life, for the simple reason that he suffered his entire life for something that was outside his control. His quirklessness was an unfair condition he didn't choose nor deserve, and yet he was constantly put down simply for the act of not having a power. Deep down, he wished for control that would allow him to face the so-called superior quirked population on their own level. He wanted, desired, needed, a place where factors outside of his control would have no detrimental effect on him, where he could face his peers on equal grounds. That was why, as Dekiru, he'd manifested a type territory Embryo. Then the final category. Type Maiden. Masters who developed this type of Embryo were people who didn't think of Infinite Dendrogram as just a game. To them, the weight of the lives in this world was no different than on Earth. This one was easily understandable, as within moments of joining the game, Dekiru had been unable to really see the world as a game. He'd tamed a frenzy boar using an apricot, exactly as one would have tamed a real boar, without even hesitating. He risked his life to try and save a Tion, and Franklin would bet her Embryo that he never once considered them as NPCs. These factors were what led to him gaining a type maiden with territory Embryo. But why Ereshkigal specifically? After thinking about it for a while, she finally understood, and also began to piece together how Behemoth had bit the dust like that, even if she still had trouble believing it. Ereshkigal was the goddess of the underworld in Sumerian myth, having carried out her duties of administrating the underworld since birth. She was a goddess who lived without ever knowing of the world above, or of freedom, due to a role she had been born into. In original Mesopotamian texts, she presided over the growth and decay of crops, bent the dragons and snakes to her will, and freely controlled the Garrula familiars of the underworld. The heavenly mistress Ishtar, and the queen of the great below, Ereshkigal held a rival relationship. Mythologically speaking, the goddess of the harvest Ishtar, Inanna, was the great earth mother that represented human life, though she was a total Btsich, while Ereshkigal, who represented human death, was the terrible earth mother, though she wasn't evil. Ishtar, in a sense, was Ereshkigal's literal opposite. She was a goddess born into power and freedom, being granted various authorities and showered with gifts she did not earn. The parallels between Ereshkigal and Izuku Midoriya were clear as day. The most famous and least disputed fact about Ereshkigal had to do with Ishtar's descent into the underworld, seeking to expand her territory and influence into Ereshkigal's realm. According to the legend, Ishtar passed through 7 gates, discarding a piece of her clothing at each one. The clothing was more of a symbolic thing, representing Ishtar's own authorities as a goddess. After the 7th gate, she was left naked, her power gone, and Ereshkigal butchered her and hung her corpse from a spear or something like that. Franklin wasn't too keen on the details, considering Sumerian mythology wasn't as prevalent in popular culture compared to other pantheons like the Greek and Norse, but that was the gist of it. But she had a sneaking suspicion that Dekiru's Embryo, Ereshkigal, obviously named after the Sumerian goddess, had its skills based around that aspect of her legend, her total control in the underworld. As a mythological concept, the idea of Ereshkigal was compatible with Dekiru because there were definite parallels in the way they lived and the adversity they faced. Her abilities, though, considering that she was a territory rule type, which Franklin had never heard of, not to mention the fact that her first skill was called Denial of Authority, most likely focused on the concept of removing enemy advantages within territory, similar to how the OG Ereshkigal stripped Ishtar of her authorities when she entered the underworld, Ereshkigal's turf, in reality. Once again, this concept matched Dekiru as a person, considering his situation and life on Earth. That could have also been how Dekiru had managed to defeat Behemoth, as absurd as it sounded, although the boy had gotten extremely lucky, because if her inference about his newly hatched Embryo was correct, then his little trick wouldn't have worked nearly as well against any of the other superiors. It was best to make sure though. "Hey, Ereshkigal," she called, getting the attention of the Embryo and her master. "Your first skill removes enemy stat buffs, doesn't it?" It was the only logical explanation, because of something Franklin had found out using her analyzing eye of wisdom on Behemoth and Leviathan. Ereshkigal looked at her master nervously, seeking his approval, and at his nod, turned back towards Franklin looking much more confident. "Not just enemy stat buffs. My first form skill, Denial of Authority, removes the buffs, both skill-based and status-based, of all enemies within my territory, and has a percentage chance of applying them to Master or a monster in his minion capacity. This skill's effect decreases with enemies at a higher level than Master's or a level equal to his, although it'll never be 0. Currently, I have a 7% chance to apply the removed buff to Master for a target of the same level, which increases the lower the level of the skill's target is compared to him and decreases the higher the level of the target is," said Ereshkigal proudly, placing her hands on her shapely hips. Franklin let out a low whistle. Even if the chance of the skill working dropped for enemies of a higher level, that was still a pretty powerful ability, even if it wouldn't do anything to people who actually had high stats. After all, not every player and Tion used buffs as a major part of their combat style. In fact, it was actually on the lower side of the usage tree because of other skills that prevented incantations and the like. Also, it was more or less ineffective against many kinds of monsters, as they tended to use direct attacks instead of buffs, as many lacked the tactical ability to make use of them. But it was still a really strong skill, and it also proved her hypothesis about how he had slain Behemoth. "You got really lucky," she said, smirking to herself. "You see, Behemoth's base stats are actually incredibly low, lower than even those of high-rank job users. However, she became known as the physical apex, and has ridiculous stats as a superior because of a skill called Beast Heart Possession, from the Jaguar Man grouping. What it does, it's simple. It adds the stats of a subordinate monster to the master who owns it. For the low-rank job version of the skill, which caps at level 5, it adds 25% of the monster's stats. However, as you know, Behemoth's superior job is the one corresponding to the Jaguar Man job, and dash probably gives 100% of the subordinate monster's stats, said Dekiru, realization dawning on his face. And Ereshkigal stole that skill's permanent stat boosting effect from Behemoth-san and transferred it to me, which is why I suddenly became so strong, and why my punch killed Behemoth, because I was punching her when her stat buff was gone, which made her much weaker than me, with the SR of a superior guardian bio. He blinked for a few seconds in awe, before turning to Ereshkigal, who was gauging his reaction. "You're amazing," he gushed, causing Ereshkigal to redden and stutter out a response. Then Dekiru realized that he was acting like a nerd around a girl who neither his mother nor Franklin, and then began to blush and stutter himself. The sight of it was giving Franklin diabetes. She could feel her blood sugar rising just from the sight of them. It was truly a gift from the gods above that Dekiru's bio was as much of a cinnamon roll as he was. The two of them together were practically the cutest couple Franklin had ever seen. And by couple, she meant master bio pair. Nothing else. At all. "You two are so adorable," cheered Eri, having recovered from her state of shock, reverting to her usual personality. She grabbed them both and shoved them into her chest, causing them both to struggle furiously against her. "It's just too much." Franklin let out a nervous laugh, getting the strangest feeling that in the future, Dekiru and Ereshkigal were both in serious danger, considering Arica batted for both teams. Still, she wasn't a degenerate, and Franklin knew her friend enough to know that she genuinely liked the two of them. Dekiru had a natural charm that was usually hidden until one actually got to know him a little bit, a chance that no one in the real world actually gave him. And Ereshkigal seemingly picked up many good qualities from her master, something that was pretty apparent even though she had only been born minutes ago. And better Arica than those degenerates from Legendaria, especially those freaks they called superiors. Franklin had heard that one of them had such an obsession with children that his bio actually turned people back into kids. Franklin didn't know if those rumors were true, and to be honest, for the first time in her life, she didn't want either. Still, it was probably best to get those two freed up before they died of asphyxiation. "So what loot did Behemoth drop?" asked Franklin, tilting her head. Liza released the two of them, causing them to fall over, gasping for air. Franklin idly noted that Ereshkigal was somehow even bustier than Eri, without actually making it look awkward, and felt a slight tinge of envy before turning back to her friend, who had given her a cheap, disposable inventory that contained the drop items. Nothing he can use, sadly enough. It's all high-end gear meant for people who've reached level 500 at the least, and has stat requirements way out of his pay grade. Franklin turned to Dekiru, who was getting up off the floor, while his bio was still heaving on the ground. "Did Behemoth contact you?" "I gave her your number, since she asked for it, and because you'd probably faint before you gave a girl your number," she said, a grin flickering on her face as she teased him towards the end. "She should have told you by now what to do with the drop items." He said, red dusting his cheeks at her implication. "She said to keep them and do what I wanted with them, but I want to give them back to her. After all, it's my fault she died and can't log on again for a day due to the death penalty. Besides, it wouldn't even have happened under normal circumstances. I got really lucky. Judging by the fact that the skill's effect becomes weaker the higher level the opponent is, then by my calculations, the chance of denial of authority working on Behemoth and giving me her Beast Heart Possession stat buff was only 0.000000667%. And the only reason the numbers matched up was because Ereshkigal managed to trigger a LUC increase due to the excess energy from her evolution. Something like that won't be happening anytime soon, so it doesn't feel right to take her stuff." Franklin snorted at that. He was a goody two-shoes as usual, but he actually made it seem endearing as opposed to the pro heroes, who had sticks up their SES when it came to their justice. Firstly, she wanted you to have it, so it would be rude of you to refuse her. Second, think of it as a gift from Behemoth, since I think you really made a good impression on her. Plus, none of this equipment seems like stuff Behemoth actually uses, and since UBM rewards can't be dropped by death and can't be traded, she isn't actually losing anything, except maybe her pride. Since I can see that you still don't want to do this, I'll just take them off your hands and sell them for cash I can use to make you a good monster. Dekiru looked like he was about to protest, but was thrown for a loop by Franklin's last statement. A monster? Oh, I see, said A, who was surprised for a moment before realization dawned on her. She turned to Dekiru, who looked confused. Hey cutie, you don't actually have any offensive skills, do you? Dekiru opened his mouth, but said nothing before closing it again, opening the window and scrolling through his skill list. Well, there's one, he said as he slowly began to connect the dots. But it isn't really reliable as a damage-dealing spell. This is because the druid job is a support caster job, right? Right, confirmed Franklin. Since your Embryo is a non-damage-dealing type territory rule, you have no reliable way of dealing damage to your opponents. Hence, the use of a tamed monster to deal damage for you. Heck, you should already have a taming skill from that little stunt you pulled earlier with the boar, so you don't even need to struggle that much since you won't immediately need the tamer job. I see what you mean, but using a monster to fight for me? That seems kind of cruel, said Dekiru uneasily. Ereshkigal, having remained silent until then, decided to speak up. Master, I understand your feelings, but you are looking at this the wrong way. Franklin is correct. The usage of a monster in combat is the only reliable way for us to deal damage at the current moment. Your druid job skills focus on changing the terrain around you, while mine focuses on adding bonus effects to that terrain, leaving no one to actually take advantage of it, she explained. Plus, using a tamed monster is no different from how mankind used wolves as hunting animals and domesticated wild horses to ride on. The humanity of using a tamed monster depends on how you treat it, not the act of using it. So that's why I think you should accept this offer. Dekiru still looked unsure, but ultimately decided to put his trust in the both of them. Well, okay then. Franklin smirked. I knew you'd see things my way. Fran, you would have done it whether or not he saw things your way, said A, looking at her out of the corner of her eye in mock disdain. Also true, admitted Franklin, causing Dekiru to sag, realizing he was no match for her stubbornness. Tia opened her window, checking the time, before turning to the three of them. Well, I should get back to the tow before the engineers blow something up again. I'll find you later, cutie, said A, heading off with a wave. There was a few moments of silence as the other woman walked away, before Dekiru decided to speak up with what was on his mind. Thanks for inviting me, Francesca, said Dekiru quietly once they were alone, wringing his hands nervously. Ereshkigal, sensing that he wanted to talk to Franklin privately, had excused herself to return to her crest, stating that she had some data to crunch regarding her own skills. This place. It's so amazing, he said, looking out in admiration at the landscape. It all feels so real, and even if it's my first day, I've met plenty of nice people here. Mitchum, there's still a lot more for you to see out here, Izuku. You haven't even scratched the surface of the wonders Infinite Dendrogram has to offer. You can do what you want to your heart's content here. This world follows a culture and a set of rules different from our own. I had a feeling you'd love it. I do, even if I haven't really done anything yet, he said, his ears saying in the breeze. There's a project I'm working on, said Franklin suddenly, catching his attention. A plan to build an actual humanoid mech from scratch, here in Dendro. I'll text you the situation and the blueprints IRL, but that's what my clan, the Triangle of Wisdom, was built for. You can't join a clan until you clear one low-rank job at the least, which you're almost at, so you can go wild here for a while and we can get you registered afterwards. You in? With your knowledge added to the pool I've already collected, I'm sure we can do it. That's amazing, he said with a gasp. Of course I'll help. I may not be as useful as everyone else, but I'll do my best to help you work out any KNKS in the blueprints. Thanks. Also, you should stop selling yourself short. You wouldn't have gotten into I Island Academy a year early without having talent for this sort of thing. she said, reaching out and ruffling his hair fondly, causing him to squirm. She knew he wouldn't even hesitate to give an answer. He was just that kind of guy. A boy with a dream his body wasn't made for, though his heart, mind and soul were in the right place. A kind person in a dark world. Druid, Dekiru. It had been around a minute since Franklin had left to complete some last-minute preparations and to sell the equipment and items Behemoth had dropped, and Dekiru was deep in thought, reminiscing of all the experiences he had went through since starting the game only a few hours ago. He'd tamed a rampaging frenzy boar, met and accidentally killed one of the most powerful players in the game, a feat he was pretty sure he couldn't replicate again at least level 500, and had made many new friends. It was all so amazing and surreal, and the best part was that his true Infinite Dendrogram experience hadn't even begun yet. He'd literally only been playing for a few hours, and yet he already felt better than he had in years. Around a decade, to be frank, since that fateful day when there was only one thing that was bothering him, and his new partner clearly knew it, as she manifested almost immediately when his train of thought shifted in that direction. "Master, there's no need to be worried around me," said Ereshkigal seriously, her tone making it clear she wasn't going to beat around the bush regarding the matter at hand. "I won't hurt you. You can trust me." Trust. That word stirred a few bitter feelings in his heart. He used to trust a lot in the past, but his own faith in humanity had begun to take blows ever since he was diagnosed as quirkless. He wanted to save people, yes, but that was because of his natural disposition and kindness. That didn't mean he trusted them. Deep in his heart, he knew he had been pushed far beyond that point. He trusted Ai because Francesca trusted her, and trusted Behemoth and Leviathan because Francesca didn't see them as malicious. The only people he trusted were his parents and Francesca, his only friend back before all this, made through the bond formed from shared danger. It didn't show in his attitude, because he was naturally a kind and energetic person, but after being near people for more than a few minutes, the fear and mistrust began to set in. After Bakugo, he hadn't been able to trust anybody. He'd closed his heart. Kids bullied him in awful ways, from stealing his things to outright death threats, and of course there were some who pretended to be his friend only to crush him in front of everyone. Adults would ignore his plight completely, and support everyone else, sometimes even encouraging the people who made his life hell, so his faith in authority figures was also frayed. People in stores would charge him double the cost of anything in their establishments once they saw his identification, which he had to give in order to buy anything according to the public laws due to villains with shape-shifting quirks. Places like arcades and movie theaters outright denied him access, and Izuku Midoriya knew better than to believe the police would do anything about it. The worst part was, his beloved pro-heroes weren't any better. He'd heard what the heroes had said about him after the incident where he had saved Francesca. One of them had the gall to tell his mother that a freak like him should have allowed his betters to do their jobs, instead of trying to act like he could actually have done anything. Were these the people he had looked up to since he could walk? Was this the true face of the society he so desperately wanted to protect? He was fortunate that his parents were amazing people who loved him with all their hearts despite his condition, his father even working hard overseas to provide them an easy life. But many quirkless children weren't so fortunate. Out of the 20% of the population without quirks, 15% of them were the elderly. The other 5% were children. Not even 1% of the world's adult population was quirkless. That itself was telling enough. Because quirkless children never made it to adulthood. After the villain attack, as he lay in that hospital bed, Izuku, to his own shame, had wondered if his life was even worth it. After hearing pro-heroes speak that way about him, he'd finally reached his breaking point. He took all the pain and abuse and adapted to it, so that one day he could become a hero, and then people would acknowledge his worth. He could prove he wasn't a Deku. But it was in that hospital room that he'd realized how futile that hope was. After all, how could he be sure that he wouldn't receive the same treatment even as a pro? Heck, how could he be sure that they would even allow him to have a license or even join a hero school? True, UA recently removed the rule that quirkless students couldn't join, but even so, not one quirkless student had ever attended UA, even for general education. The facts spoke for themselves. Francesca had been a beacon for him in that heartbreaking time. He'd just been so done with the world after everything he'd been through that he'd only been a few moments away from trying to strangle himself with his own foreline. She'd helped him out of it, helped him come to terms with himself and follow a new path, and for that he would be eternally grateful to the French girl. It was thanks to her, and of course, the support of his parents, that he was even able to attend Island Academy now, the best high school on the planet. He'd been recovering a bit from then, but Izuku knew that the world hadn't changed in the least. He'd been a shut-in during that time PRD, studying for his entrance exams. That didn't mean the world had magically become better. Still, Izuku knew in his heart that he would still drop everything to save even people as vile as them. That was just who he was. But that didn't mean they wouldn't stab him in the back. It didn't mean he could laugh among them as equals. Because in the end, society was organized based on the power you were born with. And he was on the bottom rung of the ladder. That was partially why Infinite Dendrogram was so amazing for him. To the people here, the matters of the real world were of no consequence. The masters didn't care about what quirk he had, at least the ones he'd met up to now, and the Tians probably didn't even know what a quirk was. They treated him just like they would treat anyone else. And that meant the world to him. He'd nearly broken down when the ice cream stall owner had sold him the dessert with a kind smile, and when people had actually thanked him for helping them out. It was something he'd never experienced before outside of his family, with the exception of Francesca. But the scars in his heart still lingered and festered. A decade's worth of abuse and discrimination couldn't be washed away that easily. He'd been comfortable socializing before because he was in the presence of someone he trusted, sort of like how children felt more comfortable with their parents around. But now? He wasn't sure he could keep it up. All the times he had been duped by others kept playing in his head like a catchy song you couldn't forget, and the veritable PTSD started acting up whenever he tried talking to someone. That was why he'd barely spoken even to the ice cream vendor, a Tian, and Behemoth, who he'd believed to be a porcupine. As Dekiru, he knew that things wouldn't be the same. This world just didn't seem to be like that. But a dark part of his heart wondered if the circumstances of his birth would haunt him his whole life, even beyond the shackles of their reality. However, when it came to his Embryo, Izuku was even more wary. After all, she had been born from his own psyche, from his thoughts and actions. She knew everything about him, all his insecurities, his fears, and yet was a completely free-living and sentient being, just like anyone else. What would she think of him? Him, a fool who had denied reality for so long, reaching for a dream that society would never have let him achieve? He was shaken out of his thoughts when Ereshkigal gently pulled him up into a hug, cradling him against her bosom. "Master, I know what you've been through." Ereshkigal whispered into his ear. "We Embryos can see the memories of our masters. It's part of how our development occurs. You're an incredibly strong person, Master, who deserves much better than what fate dealt you. As your Embryo, your happiness is my first and foremost priority. As long as you keep returning to Infinite Dendrogram, I'll always be by your side. You don't need to be afraid anymore. You can trust me." She was right. She was his partner. If there was anyone he could trust in the whole world, it would be her. Dekiru hesitated for a few moments, before he tentatively hugged the Embryo back, receiving a radiant smile in return. "Whatever we face, let's promise to do our best, okay?" asked Ereshkigal, putting out her fist. "Yeah," said Dekiru, bumping her fist with his own, bearing a small smile. "Let's do our best, Ereshkigal." "Of course, Master." It wasn't a full recovery. Far from it. But as Dekiru, with his Embryo partner Ereshkigal by his side, Izuku Midoriya had begun walking the path towards rehabilitation. And a new future. It looked like for the first time, the path he was walking down was nothing short of smooth sailing. "Druid, Dekiru." "Wait, where are we? Weren't you going to make a monster?" asked Dekiru, confused. "Master's right. Why did you bring us here, Miss Franklin?" asked Ereshkigal, standing by his side. The three of them were standing in front of what looked like a modern bar, straight out of the more recent movies. They were definitely in the shadier part of the capital, as could be referenced by their dank surroundings as well as the general atmosphere. Franklin had led them there as soon as Dekiru came back to the city after talking to Ereshkigal, saying that it was important. Call me Mr. Franklin, or just Franklin when we're in public, sweetie, said Franklin to Ereshkigal, slipping back into her more mad scientist way of speaking now that they were back in a populated area. And I already made the monsters a while back. However, you're not ready for them the way you are right now. You already made them? Asked Dekiru, confused. Then why did you take the money? Because I sort of racked up a huge debt because of how much I poured into them, so the cash from selling the porcupine's drops should more than make up for how much I lost, said Franklin, grinning. Dekiru looked aghast. You got into debt because of this? Well, it was inevitable. I wanted only the best for you, after all. Besides, you're technically paying for it anyways, so it isn't like I gave you a total freebie. Still, I don't regret a thing, so don't get it into that pretty little head of yours that this is somehow your fault. Dekiru's cheeks colored from embarrassment, as Franklin had been able to accurately tell he would blame himself, but he chose to pull his hood down and mumble to himself. After all, there was no point arguing about something that had already happened with someone whose stubborn nature rivaled his own. Instead, he chose to sort of change the topic. What do you mean when you say I'm not ready? He asked curiously. Minion capacity, I think, said Ereshkigal, looking at Franklin for confirmation. Seeing the bespectacled master nod, she continued. Minion capacity is necessary to bring out the full potential of tamed monsters. If Franklin's monsters are high in quality, you won't have the minion capacity required to hold them, because the druid job doesn't increase it by much. Since it isn't a job that focuses too much on it, though it is of the taming category, just like Jaguar Man, a similar job which also has poor minion capacity. Therefore, the only solution is to get a job that has a high minion capacity, like the tamer job. Close enough, agreed Franklin, before a wicked smirk crossed her face. Although the job we're here for isn't the tamer job, but is actually the job with the highest natural minion capacity among the low-rank jobs. Master, I suddenly feel very afraid, said Ereshkigal nervously. Dekiru swallowed, mentally agreeing with her. He really didn't like the creepy smile on Franklin's face. It usually preceded some kind of disaster. The three of them exited the establishment around 10 minutes later, with Dekiru looking like he was having a midlife crisis, Ereshkigal blushing furiously, and Franklin laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "Wi?" he asked pitifully, looking at his new job. A job from the Tamer grouping that focused specifically on taming female monsters. On paper, it wasn't as embarrassing as the name would make it seem. However, both Franklin and the manager of the building, which was actually the PMP's guild, God, that sounded wrong, cracked too many jokes about it for him to be completely okay with it. As soon as he had touched the crystal, his window exploded into messages once more, as the leftover EXP from when he had killed Franklin brought its level all the way to within a few hours. He was already a total level of that was pretty amazing, but Dekiru knew better than to fool himself into thinking that things would always be that easy. He'd just gotten phenomenally lucky with Behemoth, and only one thanks to the fact that he had a compatibility advantage over her, as his Embryo nullified the skill that made her a monster among superiors. That sort of thing wouldn't happen twice. He'd merely gotten a bit of a head start. I really need to check out my skills later, he thought to himself. With one thing after another happening since the moment he had logged in, he hadn't been able to see even a single one of the numerous skills he had gotten for jumping nearly 100 levels. But first, he was too busy dying of embarrassment. For most of his life, he had wanted to become a hero. A shining paragon of justice who would protect the innocent and stop the guilty. A person people could look up to, and a person whose presence meant that everything would be okay. Instead, he became a PMP. Mom must never find out. He would carry the secret to his grave. Franklin finally had her fill of laughs at his expense, quieting down and patting his head. "Don't be like that," she said pleasantly. "Sure, it's not a job many people take because of its name and association, but practicality is always better than appearance. You needed to become a PMP, because there's no other way you can tame the monsters I made. They honestly exceeded even my expectations." "Okay," he said in a small voice. Once again, there was no use arguing about something that had already happened. He just had to live with it, or at least level up the job so he could choose another as his main job and forever mask his shame. Dekiru focused on the path they were walking, and to his surprise, found that they were actually reaching the outskirts of the city. "We're heading outside the city walls?" he muttered to himself curiously before his eyes widened. "Wait a minute, don't tell me you dash." "Yeah, I released them into the wild after I created them," said Franklin, smirking at him. They needed exposure to a natural environment in order to mentally develop properly. After all, unlike my normal creations, these are meant to be less like actual cannon fodder minions and more like Pokémon. Keeping them in a lab or a jewel for the entirety of their natural lives since birth won't be good for them psychologically. Makes sense? Yeah, he admitted, noting that the point was a pretty good one. But how long have you been doing this to figure that out? Franklin grinned. You do realize my Embryo specializes in monster creation, right? And so do my jobs. I've been doing this since I started playing. Most of the monsters I created were made to be dumb on purpose, mentally programmed to follow different commands. But that isn't the case with these two. Don't take my word for it though, because this next part is all on you. I'll give you the bait, but it's up to you to tame those two rascals. Franklin took something out of her inventory, and Dekiru's eyes widened comically. Is that Dash? High-quality premium vodka. Can't get anything better in the entirety of the kingdom, she said proudly. What kind of monsters drink vodka? Hissed Dekiru. Go and find out, said Franklin with a wide grin. I'll be logging out for the day pretty soon, so when you've got them, head to the Adventurers Guild and take a quest. Sigh. Knowing that arguing was pointless, Dekiru and Ereshkigal began to move out into the natural dungeon that bordered the city. It was nothing special, as the land around Drife was low in terms of FRY, a simple plain dotted with sparse trees. In fact, he didn't even see any monsters visible to him, so he decided to go further into the area. Master, we're about to head into hostile territory, warned Ereshkigal. Have you checked out your skills? No, he hadn't. Sorry. Give me a second, he said apologetically. He'd forgotten that they were heading into hostile territory, and Ereshkigal didn't have any direct offense skills. An oversight on his part, one that he wasn't going to repeat again. Dekiru swiped to open his menu and accessed his skill list. The contents were as follows. Circle of Stars. Summon Starlight. Gravity Tether. Starbolt. Celestial Blessing. Starlight. Gravity Sphere. Gravity Mine. Star Map. Cosmic Terrain. Stargazer. Male Temptation. Female Monster Strengthening. Female SLV Strengthening. Influence, PMP. All of them were only level 1, something that wasn't really surprising considering he hadn't used any of them, but going through the skill descriptions on the window made Dekiru realize that the skills in question were no joke regardless of level. Tame was an obvious skill. It allowed him to tame a monster, which basically had the same conditions as catching a Pokémon. Every monster had a fixed taming rate, which was influenced by various factors like the level of the monster, the level of the user, etc. It was the only extra skill he had learned, which made sense since he hadn't really done anything special, except pull a reverse Uno card on one of the strongest players in Infinite Dendrogram. He hoped Behemoth wouldn't hold a grudge against him for that. Anyways, almost all of his other skills were from his druid job. Checking what they were, Dekiru found himself really confused. In popular culture, druids were sort of like hermit mages that lived in forests and manipulated plant life. In some incarnations, this ability was a little more fleshed out as manipulation of their natural environment through the use of magic, changing the spells and magic used by a druid by the region they were born in. However, his skills from that job were nothing like either of them, at least at first glance. The first skill actually didn't do anything. It was called Circle of Stars. According to the skill description, this particular skill decided the development pattern of the druid grouping jobs depending on the aptitude and talent of the job owner, as well as the environment the job crystal was located in. Once a circle was decided by the job, it could never be changed, even if the job was reset and releveled. That skill made sense, because druids in different environments would have different skills. For example, a druid obviously wouldn't have the same skills in the desert and in the forest. But a star druid? That was something that came out of left field for Dekiru. To be honest, it was technically possible that the sky could be considered a type of biome in its own right, but that didn't really lessen the surprise. Admittedly, it was interesting. He had taken the job expecting to become a woodland mage, but the reality was as odd as it was intriguing. The skills that came with the job reflected the nature of his circle. The first and most important was Summon Start. It was the staple skill of his job, and almost all of the skills that came after it depended on it in order to be cast. It summoned a type of monster called a Start. According to the text description, a starite was a type of cosmic nature spirit attuned to the stars that had no real-life signs, and acted as a focus for weak druids of the star circle who couldn't draw power directly from the cosmos, assisting in the casting of their spells. Translation: because he only had the low-rank druid job, he had the limitation of needing a starite to use his skills. Getting the high-rank high druid would probably remove that limitation. He could only summon one starite at the moment, and it lasted only for a PRD of time proportional to the MP he spent to summon it. As it had little sentience, he could manipulate its movement directly in order to aim some of his skills. The other skills were mostly geared towards offense and support. Gravity Tether was exactly what it sounded like. It manipulated the gravitational effects of the starite in order to tether a target and lock them in place. A support skill used to restrict enemy mobility. Only real weakness was that it could only be cast within a certain distance from a starite. Starbolt caused the starite to fire off laser beams. Pretty straightforward, and his only real direct offense skill. Celestial Blessing was a buff skill that provided a small increase to all stats, but could only be casted on allies within the radius of a starite. At this point, Dekiru noticed that his viability in battle depended completely on how he positioned the starite he summoned, because a great deal of his druid skills depended on it. Starlight was a healing skill which had the same conditions as the skill before it. However, as a result, it was fairly powerful for a low-rank job skill. Gravity Sphere was a sacrificial skill that turned a summoned starite into a bomb that could be flung in a certain direction, drawing nearby targets to it before exploding. Using the skill, however, sealed his summoned starite for about 10 seconds. Gravity Mine was a more passive trap skill that created gravity mines within range of a starite. The mines took a few seconds to prime themselves before detonating when triggered. Star Map was an extra skill that added information to his map. Unlike before, he could now view the weather patterns in the areas registered. The skill actually had historical reference. Ancient civilizations and even sailors often used the position of stars and constellations as a means of mapping locations, forecast, and prophecy. Curiously enough, a message was displayed below the skill. This skill cannot level up without the corresponding high-rank job. Dekiru raised a brow. So some skills have conditions like this too? Cosmic Terrain was a skill that allowed him to lock his starite in place, though as a consequence, he could manipulate the gravity in its vicinity. Stargazer was the final druid skill, and was a passive self-buff that increased his HP, SP, and MP regent when a starite was on the field. Just like Star Map, it couldn't level up without the high-rank job from the druid grouping. Those were all the skills he received from his first job, and they were pretty exciting. The ones from his second job, however, he wasn't too enthused about. Male Temptation was pretty straightforward. It was a charm skill mainly optimized for use against females. Female SLV Strengthening and Female Monster Strengthening were exactly what they sounded like. Dekiru pointedly refused to acknowledge the existence of the former skill. Influence, PMP, increased the returns from any quest or task a female under his command undertook. From a business point of view, it was pretty valuable. Having gone over all his usable options, Dekiru decided it was time to go onwards. They didn't get to take more than 10 steps in before they were confronted by a monster. "That's a dash," began Dekiru, surprised. "Angry boar," said Ereshkigal with a little giggle. "A lesser version of the frenzy boar from before. What are the odds?" The Embryo didn't wait for an answer, instead dissolving into the earth, causing the surrounding area's color to fade as her denial of authority took effect, and she slipped into her active form. The oversized pig was indeed similar to the creature Dekiru had faced earlier, though it was a little bit smaller in size. Maybe it was younger? He didn't get much time to think on it, as the angry boar has reasoned that he was its enemy and charged him. Dekiru reacted immediately, a skill having already been present on the top of his tongue. Summon Starlight. Dekiru felt his MP drain before a sphere of softly glowing light winked into existence, the same color as the starry night sky, a nebulous blue-purple studded with pinpricks of bright white. The starlight was awe-inspiring up close, but unfortunately, it couldn't really do anything on its own. Being in proximity to it was triggering his passive skill, which began slowly restoring the MP he had spent to summon the starlight, but that was it. Which meant he had to supplement the little spirit with a skill. Star Bolt. He intoned, and the starlight glowed briefly before firing a bolt of light that struck the charging boar in the face. The skill melted off the boar's face as it scored a direct hit, which caused the beast itself to burst into pixels as it expired, leaving behind its hide as a loot drop. Seeing his new powers in action made Dekiru a little awed but also pretty queasy. He was a gentle soul, and yet, it felt like he had just killed a living creature in a rather brutal way. It was a little disturbing, but he shook his head to clear away such thoughts. After all, the boar was a monster. It would no doubt have attacked someone else if he hadn't dealt with it. Plus, this was supposed to be a game. It would be embarrassing if he started feeling remorseful for killing a mob. "There's no need to feel bad, master," replies Ereshkigal soothingly. "This is what they live for. In the end, it's just the cycle of life. Humans kill monsters and monsters kill humans. Very few monsters can be reasoned with, as many lack the sentience needed for negotiation, and even those that do often refuse to find a way to coexist. They have only one primary directive, to attack anything that moves." "I get it," said Dekiru softly, though his eyes didn't stray from the spot the boar had died. "I'm sorry, Ereshkigal. I'm just being silly." "I don't think so, master. Empathy isn't silly, even if many might think so. In my opinion, it is a quality more valuable and more rare than any skill." He smiled at her attempt to cheer him up, transmitting his thanks and causing Ereshkigal to stutter out a reply. To us. Nice to have a friend within his age group. A foreign experience, but one he was slowly getting used to. His face brightened as the wind ruffled his hair, and he took a deep breath. This wasn't Earth, with its quirk discrimination and societal norms. This was Infinite Dendrogram, an incredible world where the possibilities were limitless, as long as you were willing to reach for them. He knew this logically, but it wasn't something that truly sunk in all that quickly from an emotional and mental standpoint. Well, he had plenty of time for that to happen, because he wasn't going to quit anytime soon. Now, it was time to get back to business and to quit being such a wimp. So, he had to find what sounded like multiple vodka-drinking monsters. As he walked, picking up his drop item, called a rage pelt, Dekiru racked his brain for any kind of monster which consumed alcohol. Predictably, he was running a blank. While he could think of several creatures that could consume alcohol, he didn't know of anything that preferred it. Franklin seemed pretty confident that he would find them on his own though, so he just walked off in a random direction. As he did, however, he couldn't shake the sudden feeling that he was being watched. Okay, he was definitely being watched. Star Bolt. Another laser beam shot from his starlight, sweeping across two angry boars and roasting them. While their name was pretty lame, the little critters could surprisingly cover ground and hit hard when motivated. Not that he had let them touch him, but the damage they caused to the environment was a testament to their strength. Still, the angry boars weren't really on his mind at the moment. Due to various circumstances, Dekiru had a relatively honed ability to tell when someone was watching him. Mostly, it was due to his constant state of paranoia in school, which was only increased after his encounter with that villain. This pseudo-sixth sense made him realize that he was being observed for almost 10 minutes. He couldn't see anyone, and Ereshkigal felt no one within her territory radius, which meant that he was being observed from a distance. The gaze didn't seem to be hostile, but that didn't make him lower his guard. After all, player killers were an unfortunate reality, especially in games like this one, which in some ways actively promoted conflict. Still, he was suddenly struck by a thought as he collected the rage pelts that lay on the partially singed grass. He opened his inventory pouch and took out the bottle of vodka, before placing it on the ground. He popped the cap off with his now superhuman strength and placed it on the ground. Having a second thought, he also placed a plate of sandwiches he had picked up earlier from the eatery he had visited with Ric, Franklin, and the Beast duo. His offerings completed, he waited patiently for his stalkers to take the bait. And take it they did, peeking out from behind a nearby tree and scurrying forward. They were some of the cutest creatures he had ever seen. The words above each of their heads read, "High-End Squire Imp." The twins, because there were nothing else they reasonably could have been, were about 2 feet tall. One was pink, and the other was blue. They each had small horns that were more akin to buds than actual protrusions and small tails. The pink one was way more active, chittering excitedly at the offered refreshments, while the blue one was more reserved and cautious, though there was no denying the scent of food and vodka had gotten it hooked. "They're so cute," squealed Ereshkigal mentally through their link, as she had chosen to remain in territory form to avoid spooking them. "Yeah," he admitted, watching with fascination as the 2 imps slowly crawled forwards, keeping their eyes locked onto his as they cautiously approached. "Hey, what exactly is a Squire Imp? And what does high-end tag refer to?" A Squire Imp is a type of devil that is usually summoned by Satanists as a minion. While they are as mischievous and sometimes just as cruel as their normal counterparts, they show exceptional loyalty to their contractors and are thus more easily controllable. High-end indicates the monster is a fairly powerful variant of its race, or that it has a unique skill. Interesting. The explanation answered why Franklin had created these particular creatures for him, but opened up a lot more questions. He really needed to find a library soon so he could read up on the various types of monsters and the background lore of the world. But in the meantime, he watched as the 2 imps finally made their way towards him, allured by the bait and feeling less threatened since he had put away his staff. He smiled gently, doing his best to avoid spooking them and making them violent, and took the bottle. They tensed, but relaxed when he began pouring it into cups he had placed out. The imps didn't have to wait long to begin their meal. They chugged the vodka with a passion only seen in dock workers and sailors, before devouring the food offered with it. Meanwhile, Dekiru did his best to become a statue, keeping his breathing to a minimum. He was getting what could only be reasonably described as the Safari Zone experience, and as such was now incredibly nervous since the novelty had worn off. Once they had finished, Dekiru moved in for the kill. Male temptation. To an onlooker, it would appear as though his natural charm and handsome appearance had been amplified, which was pretty much what the skill hinged on, as it was more effective the more attractive the user was. His locks swayed charmingly in the non-existent breeze, his eyes shone with emotion, and the color of his lips seemed way more defined than usual, while his smile looked like it could illuminate the deepest reaches of the sea. Needless to say, it was super effective. Their skin darkened with what Dekiru didn't realize was a blush, and they shyly made their way over to him. Needless to say, they had now entered a tameable state. He rubbed their heads, having experience from the various petting zoos he had visited as a child, and completed the taming process. The imps purred in unison, and Dekiru felt magic flowing between them as the contract was sealed. High-end Squire Imps, Rosalia and Leia have been tamed. Minion capacity limit reached. So Franklin had named them? The pink imp was Rosalia, while blue imp was Leia. Dekiru flinched in surprise when both of them scampered up his arms and perched on his shoulders. By some unspoken rule, no doubt due to the contract between the tamer, Dekiru, and themselves, they were content to leave the next moves to him. Rosalia chattered excitedly as she bounced on his shoulder, filled with energy while her sister just slumped against him lazily. They squeaked in surprise when Ereshkigal returned to her maiden form, peering at them curiously. Rosalia jumped from his shoulder into her arms, looking up at her with interest, while Leia decided to watch the proceedings from the relative safety of her perch, content to let her twin expend all her energy. While the scene was cute, Dekiru had a very important question. How exactly were these 2 munchkins supposed to help him in battle? They weren't physically imposing in any sense of the word, and hadn't displayed any actual combat ability so far. They seemed more like excited children than monsters. Well, Rosalia seemed more like an excited child. Leia looked like she was done with the world, and all of its problems, in a manner similar to that of the erasure hero, Eraserhead. So why was Franklin so confident that they would help him? His question was answered when an angry boar wandered onto the scene. It took one look at the intruders on what it considered its turf, and zoomed towards them with a burst of speed comparable to the sprint of an Olympian athlete, tearing up the grass with the force of its charge. Dekiru reacted accordingly, a skill on the edge of his lips, but it proved unnecessary, as the boar didn't even make it halfway towards him before being cut off. Rosalia and Leia both reacted even faster than he did, maybe due to their monster reflexes, and teleported from their respective positions, dropping from the space directly above the charging boar. Their claws extended, before being coated in magical energy, which appeared as an ethereal shell above their respective digits, and the twins slashed down, projecting arcs of energy that slammed into the boar, cutting it off in its tracks. Lilia's attack had cut its legs off, halting its forward momentum and causing it to stumble directly into her sister's attack, which beheaded it. It was a flawless execution performed with stunning synergy. Dekiru and Ereshkigal just gaped at the scene, having been caught completely by surprise. Maybe they aren't so weak after all, he said sheepishly, not knowing what else to say in light of what had just happened. Apparently so, replied his Embryo, sporting a similarly flummoxed expression. Rosalia grabbed the rage pelt left behind, and ran towards him on her tiny legs, before holding it out proudly, verbally demanding praise via a rictus of expectant squeaks. Leia lagged behind sleepily, but looked up at him as if asking how she did. The now far more wary Dekiru smiled nervously before rubbing both their heads and offering them a compliment on a job well done. That was apparently the right thing to do as they puffed up with glee, before teleporting back to their perches on either of his shoulders, causing him to stagger in surprise. Ereshkigal tried not to laugh at the scene, and failed miserably. Queen of the Great Below, Ereshkigal. Which of these quests do you think we should take? Asked her master, gesturing up at the bulletin board filled with different requests. The two little squire imps were snoozing inside the jewel now on the back of her master's right hand. They hadn't wanted to go, but Dekiru gently explained to them why they couldn't remain outside, before promising to let them out once they were on their way. The twins had a high enough degree of intelligence to understand his speech, and Leia convinced her sister to go along with it, preventing a drawn-out argument. Knowing the blue imp though, she probably just wanted to nap. Ereshkigal was quite fond of them, despite only meeting the imps less than an hour earlier. They were cute and rather strong monsters despite their size. They had many useful skills and pretty decent stats. Lilia's stats were more focused on END, HP and SR, while Rosalia was more suited for offense, focusing on MP, AGI and STR. They both shared a skill called Unison Raid, which allowed them to synchronize perfectly and launch combination attacks and maneuvers. A skill meant for twin monsters who shared a strong bond with one another. They also shared another 3 skills: Enhance Armament, Blink, and Songstress. The former was a skill that used MP to reinforce their physical weapons and enhance their parameters. This skill was what they had used to enhance their claws earlier. Blink was a line-of-sight teleportation skill, which was pretty. It was an excellent mobility skill, though it had a cooldown of at least a minute. Songstress made no sense, because neither of them could actually sing, but it was nevertheless a skill that enhanced their musical skills. A little weird, but nothing too surprising. They possessed one more skill, although it wasn't shared like the other ones. Rosalia had Molotov Slash, which was a flaming attack that inflicted a poison debuff similar to drunkenness on the target. Leia had Snow Globe Blitz, a defensive skill that created a shield of magical ice that could absorb a certain amount of damage while buffing her own END. This vast array of abilities proved that Franklin had really outdone herself, creating top-of-the-line monsters for her master to tame and use in battle. Ereshkigal reminded herself to thank the bespectacled men, though she was a woman in Master's world, the next time she saw them for such a kind gift. Her master had precious few people who cared about him, so it warmed her heart to see such kindness shown his way. After all, she existed for her master's sake. That was her purpose as an Embryo. If it would keep her master safe and happy, she would forfeit her existence without hesitation. That was the extent of her love for him. The thought made her cheeks warm up before she shook her head, clearing the wayward thoughts away, and scanned the different requests pinned on the board. They had registered at the Adventurers Guild in Vandalheim, and after her master had logged out temporarily to make sure he had no other business in his native world, he decided to take a quest. Despite his timid nature and the excitement of the past couple hours, he was quickly beginning to acclimatize himself to this world, which was a good thing. After all, despite her foremost wish being Dekiru's well-being, she still had the instinctive desire of all embryos to grow stronger and evolve. It was why she looked up to Leviathan. The blue-haired type maiden with guardian bio was a superior embryo, the pinnacle of evolution that she strived for, and a role model, especially to a fellow maiden like herself. She wanted to become strong enough to shield her master from harm and reach a level where she could effectively remove any and all threats to his well-being. Exploration and questing was the key to reaching that goal. "We can actually turn this one in right now," she said, picking up a form. The quest said to hunt 10 angry boars and deliver their pelts to the guild, where they would be picked up. "You're right," agreed Dekiru thoughtfully, before taking the form. "But it's probably not good to turn in a quest like that, so we'll take another one and then turn it in later. Any other quests in mind?" That was a tough question. Most of the remaining quests were ones that could only safely be taken in a party, having a minimum requirement of at least 2 people. While she could pass herself off as another person, doing so would impact her master's safety considering the difficulty level might prove too maybe for them to overcome, despite Dekiru's leap in strength from killing Behemoth. And they didn't have anyone they could party with, since they didn't know anyone apart from Behemoth, Arica, and Franklin. However, they didn't know where to find Arica. Behemoth was stuck in her death penalty, and Franklin was logged off, so all those options were unavailable. What to do? It was somewhat unusual that all the simple monster hunting quests were few in number and pretty much taken, but in hindsight it made sense. The Drife Imperium as a whole was a kingdom that lacked natural resources. They had an abundance of wealth and technology, but things like dungeons and even food production were severely limited. It was more of a trade hub, though not to the same extent of Caldina, which was why 90% of the available quests were party escort quests for merchants. The only other quests were crafting quests, requesting the DLVRY of some kind of item, but they didn't have enough knowledge to complete a quest like that. They were in quite the pickle. Fortunately, her master was a rather lucky person, despite his circumstances. Maybe it was a trade-off for all he had suffered in life due to the misfortune of his birth, but opportunities tended to spring up around him. In this particular case, said opportunity beckoned in the form of a voice from behind them. "Excuse me, but are you looking for a quest to take?" They both turned to the speaker, a rather curious character. He looked about her master's age, with red eyes, spiky red hair and an exuberant grin that was slightly menacing but not unkind. He wore a rather strange outfit reminiscent of one that pro heroes wore, consisting of 2 dark red, gear-shaped shoulder pads, and a sash with a red R on its center. Alongside this he had dark red boots, black pants with a ripped cape and black sleeves. His muscular chest was left bare and he wore a black jaw guard that reached around his head. His attire drew a few curious looks, but hero cosplay and roleplay wasn't all that uncommon among masters, so it wasn't like he really stood out. Still, he cut a rather imposing figure despite his height, though not in a bad way. "The name's Red Riot," he said, pointing a thumb at himself, before rubbing his head sheepishly. "I have a quest that needs 2 people, and I don't really know anyone. Do you 2 mind taking it with me?"